Story 1 of Dastardly Criminals in Space. Ed Reed's Short Sci-Fi, Volume 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Conspiracy on Callisto by James McCrae. Chapter 1. Dwayne's hand flicked to his waist and hung there, poised. His disc gun remained undrawn. The tall, white-haired man, Stevens, smiled. "You're right, Dwayne," he said. "I could blast you, too. Nobody would win that way. So let's leave the guns where they are." The muscles twitched in Peter Dwayne's cheeks, but his voice, when it came, was controlled. "Don't think we're going to let this go," he said. "We'll take it up with Andreas tonight. We'll see whether you can cut me out." The white-haired man's smile faded. He stepped forward, one hand bracing him against the thrust of the rocket engines underneath. Holding to the guide rail at the side of the ship's corridor, he said, "Dwayne, Andreas is your boss, not mine. I'm a freelance. I work for myself. When we land on Callisto tonight, I'll be with you when you turn our, shall I say, our cargo over to him, and I'll collect my fair share of the proceeds. That's as far as it goes. I take no orders from him." A heavy-set man in blue appeared at the end of the connecting corridor. He was moving fast, but stopped short when he saw the two men. "Hey," he said, "change of course. Get to your cabins." He seemed about to walk up to them, then reconsidered and hurried off. Neither man paid any attention. Dwayne said, "Do I have to kill you?" It was only a question as he asked it, without threatening. A muted alarm bell sounded through the PA speakers, signaling a 1-minute warning. The white-haired man cocked his eyebrow. "Not at all," he said. He took the measure of his slim, red-headed opponent. Taller, heavier, older, he was still no more uncompromisingly belligerent than Dwayne, standing there. "Not at all," he repeated. "Just take your 10,000 and let it go at that. Don't make trouble. Leave Andreas out of our private argument." "Damn you," Dwayne flared. "I was promised 50,000. I need that money. Do you think—" "Forget what I think," Stevens said, his voice clipped and angry. "I don't care about fairness, Dwayne, except to myself. I've done all the work on this. I supplied the goods. My price is set, 100,000 Earth dollars. What Andreas promised you is no concern of mine. The fact is that, after I've taken my share, there's only 10,000 left. That's all you get." Dwayne stared at him a long second, then nodded abruptly. "I was right the first time," he said. "I'll have to kill you." Already his hand was streaking toward the grip of his disc gun, touching it, drawing it forth. But the white-haired man was faster. His arms swept up and pinioned Dwayne, holding him impotent. "Don't be a fool," he grated. "Dwayne." The PA speaker rattled, blared something unintelligible. Neither man heard it. Dwayne lunged forward into the taller man's grip, sliding down to the floor. The white-haired man grappled furiously to keep his hold on Peter's gun arm, but Peter was slipping away. Belatedly, Stevens went for his own gun. He was too late. Dwayne was out and leveled at him. "Now, you will listen to me," Dwayne panted. But he halted, and the muzzle of his weapon wavered. The floor swooped and surged beneath him as the thrust of the mighty jets was cut off. Suddenly there was no gravity. The two men, locked together, floated wastelessly out to the center of the corridor. "Course change," gasped white-haired Stevens. "Good God!" The ship had reached the midpoint of its flight. The bells had sounded, warning every soul on it to take shelter, to strap themselves in their pressure bunks against the deadly stress of acceleration as the ship reversed itself and began its headlong plunge into Callisto. But the two men had not heeded. The small steering rockets flashed briefly. The men were thrust bruisingly against the side of the corridor as the rocket spun lazily on its axis. The side jets flared once more to halt the spin, when the 180 turn was completed, and the men were battered against the opposite wall, still weightless, still clinging to each other, still struggling. Then the main drive bellowed into life again, and the ship began to battle against its own built-up acceleration. The corridor floor rose up with blinking speed to smite them. and the lights went out in a burst of crashing pain for Peter Duane. Someone was talking to him. Duane tried to force an eye open to see who it was and failed. Something damp and clinging was all about his face, obscuring his vision. But the voice filtered in. "Open your mouth," it said. "Please, Peter, open your mouth. You're all right. Just swallow this." It was a girl's voice. Duane was suddenly conscious that a girl's light hand was on his shoulder. He shook his head feebly. The voice became more insistent. "Swallow this," it said. "It's only a stimulant to help you throw off the shock of your accident. You're all right, otherwise." Obediently, he opened his mouth and choked on a warm, tingly liquid. He managed to swallow it and lay quiet as deft, feminine hands did something to his face. Suddenly, light filtered through his closed eyelids, and a cool air stirred against his damp face. He opened his eyes. A slight, red-headed girl in white nurse's uniform was standing there. She stepped back a pace, a web of wet gauze bandage in her hands, looking at him. "Hello," he whispered. Where am I?" "In the sick bay," she said. "You got caught out when the ship changed course. Lucky you weren't hurt, Peter. The man you were with, the old white-haired one, Stevens, wasn't so lucky. He was underneath when the jets went on. 3 ribs broken. His lung was punctured. He died in the other room an hour ago." Duane screwed his eyes tight together and grimaced. When he opened them again, there was alertness and clarity in them, but there was also bafflement. "Girl," he said, "who are you? Where am I?" "Peter," there was shock and hurt in the tone of her voice. Don't you know me, Peter?" Duane shook his head confusedly. "I don't know anything," he said. I don't even know my own name."
Duane, the man's heavy voice said. "That won't wash. Don't play dumb on me."
"Duane," he said. "Duane." He swiveled his head and saw a dark, squat man frowning at him. "Who are you?" Peter asked. The dark man laughed.
"Take your time, Duane," he said easily. "You'll remember me. My name's Andreas. I've been waiting here for you to wake up. We have some business matters to discuss."
The nurse, still eyeing Duane with an odd bewilderment, said, "I'll leave you alone for a moment. Don't talk too much to him, Mr. Andreas. He's still suffering from shock."
"I won't,"
Andreas promised, grinning. Then, as the girl left the room, the smile dropped from his face.
"You play rough, Duane," he observed. "I thought you'd have trouble with Stevens. I didn't think you'd find it necessary to put him out of the way so permanently. Well, no matter. If you had to kill him, it's no skin of my nose. Give me a release on the merchandise. I've got your money here."
Duane waved a hand and pushed himself dizzily erect, swinging his legs over the side of the high cot. His sheet had been thrown over him, but he was fully dressed. He examined his clothing with interest. Grey tunic, grey leather spaceman's boots. It was unfamiliar. He shook his head in further confusion, and the motion burst within his skull, throbbing hotly. He closed his eyes until it subsided, trying to force his brain to operate, to explain to him where and what he was. He looked at the man named Andreas. "Nobody seems to believe me," he said, "but I really don't know what's going on. Things are moving too fast for me. Really, I don't even know my own name. My head, it hurts. I can't think clearly." Andreas straightened, turned a darkly suspicious look on Duane.
"Don't play tricks with me," he said savagely. "I haven't time for them. I won't mince words with you. Give me a release on the cargo now before I have to get rough. This is a lot more important to me than your life is."
"Go to hell," Duane said shortly. "I'm playing no tricks." There was an instant doubt in Andreas's eyes. Then it flashed away. He bent closer, peered at Duane.
"I almost think,"
he began. Then he shook his head.
"No," he said. "You're lying, all right. You killed Stevens to get his share, and now you're going to hold me up. That's your last chance that just went by, Duane. From now on, I'm running the show."
He spun around and strode to the door, thrust it open.
"Dakin," he bellowed. "Read."
2 large, ugly men in filled grey uniforms emblazoned with the shooting star insignia of Callisto's League Police came in, looking to Andreas for instructions.
"Duane here is resisting arrest,"
Andreas said.
Take him along. We'll fix up the charges later.
You can't do that,
Dwayne said wearily.
I'm sick. If you've got something against me, save it. Wait till my head clears. I'm sure I can explain.
Explain how?
The dockman laughed.
If I wait, the ship will be blasting off for Ganymede within 2 hours. I'll wait, but so will the ship. It's not going anywhere till I give it clearance. I run, Callisto. I'll give the orders here.
Chapter 2. Whoever this man Andreas was, thought Dwayne, he was certainly a man of importance on Callisto. As he said, he gave the orders. The crew of the rocket made no objection when Andreas and his men took Dwayne off without a word. Dwayne had thought the nurse, who seemed a good enough sort, might have said something on his behalf, but she was out of sight as they left. A curt sentence to a grey-clad official on the blast field where the rocket lay, and the man nodded and hurried off to tell the rocket's captain that the ship was being refused clearance indefinitely. The long, powerful ground car slid up before them. Andreas got in front, while the 2 uniformed men shoved Dwayne into the back of the car and climbed in beside him. Andreas gave a curt order, and the car shot forward. The driver sitting beside Andreas leaned forward and readied a hand under the dashboard. The high wail of a siren came instantly from the car's roof, and what traffic was on the broad, straight highway into which they had turned pulled aside to let them race through. Ahead lay the tall spires of a city. Graceful, hundreds of feet high, they seemed dreamlike, yet somehow oddly familiar to Dwayne. Somewhere he had seen them before. He dragged deep into his mind, plumbing the cloudy, impenetrable haze that had settled on it, trying to bring forth the memories that he should have had. Amnesia, they called it. Complete forgetting of the happenings of a lifetime. He'd heard of it, but never dreamed it could happen to him. My name, it seems, is Peter Dwayne, he thought, and they tell me that I killed a man. The thought was starkly incredible to him. A white-haired man, it had been, someone named Stevens. He tried to remember. Yes, there had been a white-haired man, and there had been an argument. Something to do with money, for the shipment of goods that Stevens had supplied to Dwayne. There has even been talk of killing. But murder? Dwayne looked at his hands helplessly. Andreas up ahead was turning around. He looked sharply at Dwayne for a long second. An uncertainty clouded his eyes, and abruptly he looked forward again without speaking.
Who's this man, Andreas?
Dwayne whispered to the nearest guard. The man stared at him.
Governor Andrews, he said, is the League's deputy on Callisto. You know, the Earth-Mars League. They put Governor Andrews here to govern for them.
League? Dwayne asked, wrinkling his brow. He had heard something about a league once, yes, but it was all so nebulous. The other guard stirred, leaned over.
Shut up, he said heavily. We'll have plenty of chance for talking later.
But the chance was a long time in coming. Dwayne found himself an hour later, still in the barred room into which he'd been thrust. The guards had brought him there, at Andreas's order, and left him. That had been all. This was not a regular jail, Dwayne realized. It was more like a palace, something out of Earth's Roman Empire days, all white stone and frescoed walls. Dwayne wished for human companionship, particularly that of the nurse. Of all the people he'd met since awakening in that hospital bed, only she seemed warm and human. The others were brutal, deadly. It was too bad, Dwayne reflected, that he'd failed to remember her. She seemed hurt, and she had certainly known him by his first name. But perhaps she would understand. Dwayne sat down on a lumpy, sagging bed and buried his head in his hands. Dim ghosts of memory were wandering in his mind. He tried to conjure them into stronger relief, or to exorcise them entirely. Somewhere, sometime, a man had said to him,
Andreas is secretly arming the Callistan cutthroats for revolt against the League. He wants personal power. He's prepared to pay any price for it. He needs guns, Earth guns, smuggled into the League patrol. If you can wipe out the League police garrison, those who are loyal to the League still, instead of to Andreas, he can sit back and laugh at any fleet Earth and Mars can send. Rockets are clumsy in an atmosphere. They're helpless. And if he can arm enough of Callisto's rabble, he can't be stopped. That's why he'll pay for electron rifles with their weight in gold.
Dwayne could remember the scene clearly, could almost see the sharp, aquiline face of the man who had spoken to him. But there memory stopped. A fugitive recollection raced through his mind. He halted it, dragged it back, pinned it down. They had stopped in Darkside, the spaceport on the side of Luna that keeps perpetually averted from Earth, as if the moon knows shame and wants to hide the rough and roaring dome city that nestles in one of the great craters. Dwayne remembered sitting in a low-ceilinged, smoke-heavy room, across the table from a tall man with white hair. Stephen.
4,000 electron rifles, the man had said. Latest government issue. Never mind how I got them. They're perfect. You know my price. Take it or leave it. And it's payable the minute we touch ground on Callisto.
There had been a few minutes of haggling over terms, then a handshake, and a drink from a thin-necked flagon of pale yellow liquid fire. He and the white-haired man had gone out then, made their way by unfrequented side streets to a great windowless building. Dwayne remembered the white-hot stars overhead, shining piercingly through the great transparent dome that kept the air in the sealed city of Darkside, as they stood at the entrance of the warehouse and spoke in low tones to the man who answered their summons. Then, inside, and they were looking at a huge chamber full of stacked fiber boxes, containing nothing but dehydrated dairy products and mining tools by the stencils they bore. Dwayne had turned to the white-haired man with a puzzled question, and the man had laughed aloud. He dragged one of the boxes down, ripped it open with the sharp point of a handling hook. Short-barreled, flare-mouthed guns rolled out, tumbling over the floor. 8 of them were in that one box, and hundreds of boxes all about. Dwayne picked one up, broke it, peered into the chamber where the tiny capsule of U-235 would explode with infinite violence when the trigger was pulled, spraying radiant death 3,000 yards in the direction the gun was aimed. And that memory ended. Dwayne got up, stared at his haggard face in the cracked mirror over the bed.
They say I'm a killer,
he thought.
Apparently I'm a gun runner as well. Good Lord, what am I not?
His reflection, white, drawn face, made all the more pallid by the red hair that blazed over it, stared back at him. There was no answer there. If only he could remember.
All right, Dwayne.
The deep voice of a guard came to him as the door swung open.
Stop making eyes at yourself.
Dwayne looked around. The guard beckoned.
Governor Andreas wants to speak to you. Now. Let's not keep the governor waiting.
A long, narrow room with a long carpet leading from the entrance up to a great heavy desk. That was Andreas's office. Dwayne felt a click in his memory as he entered. One of the ancient Earth dictators had employed just such a psychological trick to overawe those who came to beg favors of him. Mussolini or some such name. The trick failed to work. Dwayne had other things on his mind. He walked the 30-foot length of the room, designed to imbue him with a sense of his own unimportance as steadily as he'd ever walked in the open air of his home planet, whichever planet that was. The guard had remained just inside the door, at attention. Andreas waved him out.
Here I am,
said Dwayne.
What do you want?
Andreas said,
I've had the ship inspected, and what I want is on it. It saves your life for now, but the cargo is in your name. I could take it by force if I had to. I prefer not to.
He picked up a paper, handed it to Dwayne.
In spite of your behavior, you can keep it alive. You can even collect the money for the guns, Stephen's share as well as your own. This is a release form, authorizing my men to take 420 cases of dehydrated foods and drilling supplies from the hold of the Cameroon, the ship you came on. Sign it, and we'll forget our argument. Only sign it now and get it over with. I'm losing patience, Dwayne.
Dwayne said, without expression,
No.
Dark red flooded into Andreas's sallow face. His jaws bunched angrily, and there was a ragged thread of incomplete control to his voice as he spoke.
I'll have your neck for this, Dwayne, he said softly.
Dwayne looked at the man's eyes. Death was behind them, peeping out. Mentally, he shrugged. What difference did it make?
Give me the pen,
he said shortly. Andreas exhaled a deep breath. He could see the tension leave him, the mottled anger fade from his face, and leave it without expression. He handed the paper to Dwayne without a word. He gave him a pen, watched him scrawl his name.
"That," he said, "is better."
He paused a moment ruminatively.
"It would have been better still if you'd not stalled me so long. I found it hard to forgive in my associates."
"The money,"
Peter said. If he were playing a part, pretending he knew what he was doing, he might as well play it to the hilt.
"When do I get it?"
Andreas picked up the paper and looked carefully at the signature, creased it thoughtfully, stowed it in a pocket before answering.
"Naturally," he said, "there'll have to be a revision of terms. I offered 110,000 Earth dollars. I would have paid it, but you made me angry. You'll have to pay for that."
Dwayne said,
"I paid already. I've been dragged from pillar to post by you. That's enough. Pay me what you owe me, if you want any more of the same goods."
That was a shot in the dark, and it missed the mark. Andreas's eyes widened.
"You amaze me, Dwayne,"
he said. He rose and stepped around the desk, confronting Dwayne.
"I almost thought you really have lost your memory, Dwayne," he said. "Otherwise, surely you would know that this is all the rifles I need. With them, I'll take whatever else I want."
Dwayne said,
"You ready, then?"
He took time to think it over, but he knew that no thought was required. Already the hands that he had locked behind him were clenched, taut. Already the muscles of his legs were tensing.
"You're ready," he repeated. "You've armed the Callistan exiles, the worst gutter scum on 9 planets. You're set to betray the League that gave you power here. Well, that changes things. I can't let you do it."
He hurled himself at Andreas, hands sweeping around to grapple for the dark man's throat. Andreas, off balance, staggered backward, but his own hands were diving for the twin heat guns that hung at his waist. Dwayne saw his danger and reacted. His foot twisted around Andreas's ankle, his hands at the other's throat gripped tighter. He lunged forward, slamming the hard top of his head into the other's face, feeling flesh and cartilage give as Andreas's nose mashed flat. His own head pinwheeled dizzily, agonizingly as the jaw revived the pain of his earlier accident. But Andreas, unconscious already, tumbled back with Dwayne on top of him. His head made an audible, spine-chilling thud as it hit the carpeted floor. Dwayne got up, retrieving the 2 heat guns, and stared at him.
"They tell me I killed Stevens the same way," he thought. "I'm getting in a rut."
But Andreas was not dead, though he was out as cold as the void beyond Pluto. The thick carpeting had saved him from a broken head. Dwayne stepped over the unconscious man and looked around the room. It was furnished severely to the point of barrenness. 2 chairs before Andreas's ornate, bare-topped desk, and 1 luxurious chair behind it. A tasseled bell cord within easy reach of Andreas's chair. The long carpet. That was all it contained. The problem of getting out was serious, he saw. A good one. Chapter 3. Methodically, he ransacked the drawers of Andreas's desk. Papers, a whole arsenal of handguns, Callistan money by the bale, ominously black-covered notebooks with cryptic figures littering their pages. Those were the contents. A coldly impersonal desk, without the familiar trivia most men accumulate. There was nothing, certainly, that would get him out of a building that so closely resembled a fortress. He tumbled the things back into the drawers, helter-skelter, turned Andreas over and searched his pockets. More money. The man must have had a fortune within reach at all times, and a few meaningless papers. Dwayne took the release he had signed and tore it to shreds, but that was only a gesture. When Andreas came to, unless Dwayne had managed to get away and accomplished something, the mere lack of written permission would not keep him from the rocket's lethal cargo. When Andreas came to, an idea bloomed in Dwayne's brain. He looked then at unconscious Andreas, and the idea withered again. He had thought of facing Andreas himself to front for him, at gun's point, in the conventional manner of escaping prisoners. But fistfights, fiction to the contrary notwithstanding, leave marks on the men who lose them. Andreas's throat was speckled with the livid marks of Dwayne's fingers. Dwayne's head, butting Andreas in the face, had taken a thick stream of crimson from his nostrils, turned his sharp nose askew. No guard of Andreas's would have been deceived for an instant, looking at that face, even assuming that Andreas could have been forced to cooperate with the threat of a gun, which, considering the stake Andreas had in this play, was doubtful. He looked up and looked around. He had to act quickly. Already Andreas's breath was audible. He saw the man grimace, and an arm flopped spasmodically on the floor. Consciousness was on its way back. Duane touched the heat gun he'd thrust into his belt, drew it, and held it poised, while he sought to discover what was in his own mind. He'd killed a man already, they said. Was he then a killer? Could he shoot Andreas now, in cold blood, with so much to gain and nothing to lose? He stood there a moment. Then, abruptly, he reversed the weapon and chopped it down on Andreas's skull. There was a sharp grunt from the still unconscious man, but no other sign. Only the first tremors of movement that had shown on him halted and did not reappear.
No, Duane thought. Whatever they say, I'm not a killer.
But still he had to get out. How? Once more he stared about the room, catalogued its contents. The guard would be getting impatient. Perhaps any minute he would tap the door, first timorously, then with heavier strokes. The guard. There was a way. Duane eyed the length of the room. 30 feet. It would take him a couple of seconds to run it at full speed. Was that fast enough? There was only one way to find out. He walked around the desk to the bell cord. He took a deep breath, tugged it savagely, and at once was in speedy motion, racing toward the door, his footsteps muffled in the deep, springy carpet. Almost as he reached it, he saw it began to open. He quickly sidestepped and was out of the guard's sight, behind the door as the man looked in. Quick suspicion flared in his eyes, then certainty as he saw Andreas huddled on the floor. He opened his mouth to cry out, but Duane's arm was around his throat, and he had no breath to spare. Duane's foot lashed out, and the door slammed shut. Duane's balled left fist came up and connected with the guard's chin. Abruptly the man slumped. Duane took a deep breath and let the man drop to the floor. But he paused only a second. Now he had 2 unconscious men on his hands, and he dared let neither revive until he was prepared. He grasped the guard's arm and dragged him roughly the length of the room. He leaped on top of the desk, brutally scarring its gleaming top with the hard spikes of his boots. His agile fingers unfastened the long bell cord without causing it to ring, and, bearing it, he dropped again to the floor. Tugging and straining, he got the limp form of Andreas into his own chair, bound him with the bell cord, gagged him with the priceless Venus wool scarf Andreas wore knotted about his throat. He tested his bindings with full strength, and smiled. Those would hold, let Andreas struggle as he would. The guard he stripped of clothing, bound and gagged with his own belt and spaceman's kerchief. He dragged him around behind the desk, thrust him under it out of sight. Andreas's chair he turned so that the unconscious face was averted from the door. Should anyone look in, then, the fact of Andreas's unconsciousness might not be noticed. Then he took off his own clothes, quickly assumed the filled grey uniform of the guard. It felt like the skin of a fruit. He felt himself bulging out of it in a dozen places. The long cape the guard wore would conceal that, perhaps. In any case, there was nothing better. Trying to make his stride as martial as possible, he walked down the long carpet to the door, opened it, and stepped outside. His luck couldn't hold out forever. It was next to miraculous that he got as far as he did, out of the anteroom before Andreas's office, past the 2 guards there, who eyed him absently but said nothing, down the great entrance hall, straight out the front door. Going through the city had been easier, of course. There were many men in uniforms like this. Duane thought then that Andreas's power could not have been too strong, even over the League police, whom he nominally commanded. The police could not all have been corrupt, though too many of them. Had they been turncoats, aiding Andreas in his revolt against the League, there would have been no need to smuggle rifles in for an unruly mass of civilians. Duane cursed the lack of foresight of the early Earth governments. They had made a prison planet of Callisto, had filled it with the worst scum of Earth, Then, when damage had been done, when Callisto had become a pest hole among the planets, its iniquities a stench that rose to the stars, they had belatedly found that they had created a problem worse than the one they tried to solve, one like a hydra beast. Criminality was not a thing of heredity. The children of the transported convicts, most of them, were honest and wanted to be respectable, and they could not be. Earth's crime rate, too, had not been lowered materially by exiling its gangsters and murderers to Callisto. When it was long past time, the League had stepped in and set a governor of its own over Callisto. If the governor had been an honest man, a satisfactory solution might have been worked out. The first governor had been honest. Under him, great strides had been made. The bribe-proof, gun-handy League police had stamped out the wide-open plague spots of the planet. Public works had been begun on a large scale. The beginnings of representative government had been established. But the first governor had died, and the second governor had been Andreas.
You can see the results,
Dwayne thought grimly as he swung into the airfield in his rented ground car. Foreboding was stamped on the faces of half the Callistans he'd seen, and dark treachery in the others. Some of those men had been among the actual exiled criminals. The last convict ship had landed only a dozen years before. All of those whom Andreas planned to arm were either of the original transportation men or their weaker descendants. What was holding Andreas back? Why the need for smuggling guns in? The answer to that, Dwayne thought, was encouraging, but not conclusive. Clearly, then, Andreas did not have complete control over the League police. But how much control he did have, what officers he had won over to treachery, Dwayne could not begin to guess. Dwayne slid the car into a parking slot, switched off the ignition, and left it. It was night, but the short Callistan dark period was nearly over. A pearly glow at the horizon showed where the sun would come bulging over in a few minutes, while at the opposite rim of the planet he could still see the blood-red disk of mighty Jupiter lingering for a moment, casting a crimson hue over the landscape before it made the final plunge. The field was not floodlighted. Traffic was scarce on Callisto. Dwayne, almost invisible in the uncertain light, stepped boldly out across the jet-blasted tarmac toward the huge bulk of the Cameroon, the rocket transport which had brought him. Two other ships lay on the same seared pavement, but they were smaller. They were fighting ships, small, speedy ones, in Callisto for refueling before returning to the League's ceaseless patrol of the system's star lanes. Dwayne hesitated briefly, wondering whether he ought to go to one of those ships and tell his story to its League commander. He decided against it. There was too little certainty for him there. Too much risk that the commander, even, might be a tool of Andreas's. Dwayne shook his head angrily. If only his memory were clear. If only he could be sure what he was doing. He reached the portal of the ship. A grey-clad League officer was there, standing guard, to prevent the ship taking off.
Official business,
Dwayne said curtly, and swept by the startled man before he could object. He hurried along the corridor toward the captain's office and control room. The purser he passed looked at him curiously, and Dwayne averted his face. If the man recognized him, there might be questions. For the 1000th time, he cursed the grey cloud that overhung his memory. He didn't know even who among the crew might know him and spread the alarm. Then he was at the door marked, "Crew only. Do not enter." He tapped on it, then grasped the knob and swung it open. A squat, open-featured man in blue, the bronze eagle of the mercantile service resting lightly on his powerful shoulders, looked at him. Recognition flared in his eyes. "Dwayne," he whispered. "Peter Dwayne. What are you doing in the clothes of Andreas's household guard?" Dwayne felt the tenseness ebb out of his throat. Here was a friend.
"Captain," he said, "you seem to be a friend of mine. If you are, I need you. You see, I've lost my memory."
"Lost your memory?" the captain echoed. "You mean that blow on your head? The ship's surgeon said something. Yes, that was it. I hardly believed him, though."
"But were we friends?"
"Why, yes, Peter."
"And help me now,"
said Dwayne.
"I have a cargo stowed in your hold, Captain. Do you know what it is?"
"Why, yes, the rifles, you mean." Dwayne blinked. He nodded, then looked dizzily for a chair. The captain was a friend of his, all right. A fellow gunrunner.
"Good God," he said aloud. "What a mess."
"What's happened?" the captain asked. "I saw you in the corridor arguing with Stevens. You looked like trouble, and I should have come up to you then, but the course was to be changed. and I had to be there. And the next I hear, Stevens is dead, and you've maybe killed him. Then I heard you've lost your memory, and are in a jam with Andreas." He paused, and speculation came into his eyes, almost hostility. "Peter Duane," he said softly, "it strikes me that you may have lost more than your memory. Which side are you on? What happened between you and Andreas? Tell me now if you've changed sides on me, man. For friendship's sake, I won't be too hard on you. But there's too much at stake here." "Oh, hell," said Peter, and the heat gun was suddenly in his hand, leveled at the squat man in blue. "I wish you were on my side, but there's no way I can tell. I can trust myself, I think, but that's all. Put up your hands." And that was when his luck ran out. "Peter," the captain began. Chapter 4. But a sound from outside halted him. Together the two men stared at the viewplates. The siren had begun to shriek in the distance, the siren of a racing ground car. Through the gates it plunged, scattering the light wooden barrier. It spun crazily around on two wheels and came roaring for the ship. Andreas was in it. Peter turned on the captain, and the gun was rigidly outthrust in his hands.
"Close your ports," he snarled. "Up rockets, in a hurry."
"Listen, Peter," the captain began.
"I said hurry."
The car's brakes shrieked outside, and it disappeared from the view of the men. There was an abrupt babble of voices.
"Close your ports,"
Peter shouted savagely.
"Now!"
The captain opened his mouth to speak, then snapped it shut. He touched the stud of a communications set, said into it, "Close ports, snap to it, engine room, out rockets in 10 seconds. All crew, stand by for lift." The ship's own takeoff siren howled shrilly, drowning out the angry voices from below. Peter felt the whine of the electrics that dogged shut the heavy pressure doors. He stepped to the pilot's chair, slid into it, buckled the compression straps around him. The instruments, he recognized them all, knew how to use them. Had he been a rocket pilot before his mind had blanked, before embarking on the more lucrative profession of gun smuggler? He wondered. But it was the captain who took the ship off.
10 seconds, Peter said. "Get moving."
The captain hesitated the barest fraction, but his eyes were on the heat gun, and he knew that Duane was capable of using it. "The men," he said. "If they're underneath when the jets go, they'll burn."
"It's the chance they take,"
said Duane.
"They heard the siren."
The captain turned his head quickly, and his fingers flashed out. He was in his own acceleration seat, too, laced down by heavy canvas webbing. His hands reached out to the controls before him, and his fingers took on a life of their own as they wove dexterously across the keys, setting up fire patterns, charting a course of takeoff. Then the heel of his hand settled on the firing stop. The acceleration was worse than Peter's clouded mind had expected, but no more than he could stand. In his frame of mind, he could stand almost anything, he thought, short of instant annihilation. The thin air of Callisto howled past them, forming a high obligato to the thunder of the jets. Then the air howl faded sharply to silence, and the booming of the rockets became less a thing of sound than a rumble in the framework of the Cameroon. They were in space. The captain's foot kicked the pedal that shut off the overdrive jets, reducing the thrust to a mere one-gravity acceleration. He turned to Duane. "What now?" he asked. Duane, busy unstrapping himself from the restraining belts, shook his head without answer. What now? A damn good question, he thought. The captain, with the ease of long practice, was already out of his own pressure straps. He stood there by his chair, watching Duane closely, but the gun was still in Duane's hand, despite his preoccupation. Duane cocked an ear as he threw off the last strap. Did he hear voices in the corridor, a distance away but coming? The captain, looking out the port with considerable interest, interrupted his train of thought. "What?" he asked. "For instance, are you going to do about those?" His arm was outstretched, pointing outward and down. Duane looked in that direction. The two patrol rockets were streaking up after his commandeered ship, fairy-like in their pastel shades, with a delicate tracery of girders over their fighting noses. They nevertheless represented grim menace to Duane. He swore under his breath. The Cameroon, huge and lumbering, was helpless as a sitting bird before those light hawks of prey. If only he knew which side the ships were on, if only he knew anything. He couldn't afford to take a chance. "Stand back," he ordered the captain. The man in blue gave ground before him, staring wonderingly as Duane advanced. Dwayne took a quick look at the control setup, tried to remember how to work it. It was so tantalizingly close to his memory. He cursed again, then stabbed down on a dozen keys at random, heeled the main control down, jumped back, even as the ship careened madly about in its flight, and blasted the delicate controls to shattered ashes with a bolt from his heat gun. Now the ship was crippled, for the time being at least. Short of a nigh impossible boarding in space, the two patrol cruisers could do nothing with it till the controls were repaired. Cameroon and its cargo of political dynamite would circle through space for hours or days. It wasn't much, but it was the best he could do. At least it would give him time to think things over. No, he heard the voices of the men in the corridor again, tumbled about by the abrupt course change. Luckily, it had been only a mild thing compared to the one that had killed Stevens and caused his own present dilemma, but regaining their feet and coming on. And one of the voices, loud and harsh, was Andreas. Somehow, before the ports closed, had managed to board the Cameroon. Dwayne stood erect, whirled to face the door. The captain stood by it. Dwayne thrust his heat gun at him.
"The door," he commanded. "Lock it."
Urged by the menace of the heat gun, the captain hurriedly put out a hand to the lock of the door and jerked it back, nursing smashed knuckles as Andreas and four men burst in, hurling the door open before them. They came to a sliding, tumbling halt, though, as they faced grim Dwayne and his ready heat pistol.
"Hold it," he ordered. "That's right. Stay that way while I figure things out. The first man that moves dies for it."
Dark blood flooded into Andreas's face, but he said no word, only stood there glaring hatred. The smear of crimson had been brushed from his face, but his nose was still awry, and a huge, purplish bruise was spreading over it and across one cheek. The three men with him were guards. All were armed, the police with hand weapons as lethal as Dwayne's own, Andreas with an old-style projective-type weapon, an ancient pistol snatched from some bewildered spaceman as they burst into the Cameroon. Dwayne braced himself with one arm against the pilot's chair and stared at them. The crazy circular course the blasted controls had given the ship had a strong lateral component. Around and around the ship went, in a screaming circle, chasing its own tail. There was a sudden change in the light from the port outside. Dwayne involuntarily looked up for a moment. Dulled and purplish was the gleam from the brilliant stars all about. The Cameroon, in its locked orbit, had completed a circle and was plunging through its own wake of expelled jet gases. He saw the two patrol rockets streak past, then saw the flood of rocket flares from their side jets as they spun and braked, trying to match course and speed with the crazy orbit of the Cameroon. He looked away for only a second. Abruptly, he looked back.
"Easy,"
he snapped. Andreas's arm, which had begun to lift, straightened out, and the scowl in the governor's face darkened even more. Clackety-clack. There was the sound of a girl's high heels running along the corridor, followed by heavier thumps from the space boots of men. Dwayne jerked his gun at Andreas and his police.
"Out of the way," he said. "Let's see who's coming now."
It was the girl, red hair fluttering in the wake of her running, face alight with anxiety. She burst into the room.
"Peter!" she cried. "Andreas and his men!"
She stopped short and took in the tableau. Dwayne's eyes were on her, and he was about to speak. Then he became conscious of something in her own eyes, a sudden spark that flared even before her lips opened, and a thin cry came from them, even before she leaped to one side, at Andreas. Peter cursed and tried to turn, to dodge, tried to bring his heat gun around, but a thunder louder than the bellowing jets outside filled the room, and a streak of livid fire crossed the fringe of Peter's brain. Sudden blackness closed in around him. He fell, and his closing eyes saw new figures running into the room, saw the counterplay of lashing heat beams. This is it, he thought grimly, and then thought no more.
Chapter 4.
Dwayne was in the sick bay again, in the same bed. His head was spinning agonizedly. He forced his eyes open, and the girl was there, the same girl. She was watching him. A cloud on her face lifted as she saw his lids flicker open. Then it descended again. Her lips quivered.
"Darn you, Peter," she whispered. "Who are you now?" Why, I'm Peter Dwayne, of course," he said.
Well, thank God you know that. It was the captain. He had changed since the last time Peter had seen him. One arm was slung in bandages that bore the yellow seeping tint of burn salve. Peter shook his head to try to clear it.
Where am I?
He asked.
Andreas.
Andreas is where he won't bother you, the captain said. Locked up below. So are two of his men. The other one's dead. How's your memory, Peter? Dwayne touched it experimentally with a questing mental finger. It seemed all right, though he felt still dazed.
Coming along,
he said.
But where am I? The controls, I blasted them.
The captain laughed. I know, he said briefly. Well, I guess you had to in a way. You didn't trust anyone, couldn't trust anyone. You had to make sure the rifles wouldn't get back to Callisto too soon. But they're working on installing duplicates now, Peter. In an hour we'll be back on Callisto. We shut the jets off already. We're in an orbit. Dwayne sank back.
Listen, he said. I think my memory is clearing somehow. But how? I mean, were you on my side all along?
The captain nodded soberly. On your side, yes, Peter, he said. The League's side, that is. You and I, you know, both work for the League. When they got word of Andreas's plans, they had to work fast. To move in by force would have meant bloodshed, would have forced his hand. That would have been utterly bad. It was too dangerous. Callisto was politically a powder keg already. The whole thing might have exploded. Peter's eyes flared with sudden hope and enlightenment.
And you and I,
he began. You and I, and a couple of other undercover workers were put on the job, the captain nodded. We had to find out who Andreas's supporters were, and to keep him from getting more electron rifles while the commanders of the Callisto garrison were quietly checked to see who was on which side. They found Andreas's Earth backers, a group of wealthy malcontents who thought Callisto should be exploited for their gain, had made secret deals with him for concessions. You, of course, slowed down the delivery of the rifles as long as you could. They lay in the lunar warehouses a precious extra week while you haggled over terms. That's what you were doing with Stevens, I think, when the course change caught you both.
You've had him long enough,
the nurse broke in.
I have a few words to say. No, wait,
Dwayne protested, but the captain was grinning broadly. He moved toward the door. Later, he said over his shoulder. There'll be plenty of time. The door closed behind him. Dwayne turned to the girl. He shook his head again. The cloud was lifting. He could almost remember everything again. Things were beginning to come into focus. This girl, for instance. She noticed his motion.
How's your head, Peter? She asked, solicitously. Andreas hit you with that awful old bullet gun. I tried to stop him, but all I could do was jar his arm. Oh, Peter, I was so afraid when I saw you fall. You probably saved my life, Peter said soberly. Andreas struck me as a pretty good shot.
He tried to grin. The girl frowned.
Peter, she said, I'm sorry if I seemed rude before. The last time you were here, it was just that you didn't remember me. I couldn't understand.
Peter stared at her. Yes, he should remember her. He did, only...
Perhaps this will help you, the girl said.
She rummaged in a pocket of her uniform, brought something out that was tiny and glittering.
I don't wear it on duty, Peter, but I guess this is an exception.
Peter pushed himself up on one elbow, tried to make out what she was doing. She was slipping the small thing on a finger. A ring. An engagement ring.
Oh,
said Peter. And suddenly everything clicked. He remembered. He could recall everything. That second blow on his head had undone the harm of the first one. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, stood up, reached out hungry arms for the girl.
Of course I remember,
he said as she came into the circle of his arms.
The ring on your finger. I ought to remember. I put it there.
And for a long time after, there was no need for words. End of Story 1. Story 2 of Dastardly Criminals in Space. Ed Reed Short Sci-Fi, Volume 4. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Prison of a Billion Years by C.H. Thames. Adam Slade crushed the guard's skull with a 2-foot length of iron pipe. No one ever knew where Slade got the iron pipe, but it didn't seem so important. The guard was dead. That was important, and Slade was on the loose, with a hostage. That was even more important. The hostage's name was Marcia Lawrence. She was 22 years old and pretty and scared half out of her wits. She was, before she became a hostage, a reporter for Interplanetary Video. She had been granted the final pre-execution interview with Adam Slade, and she'd looked forward to it for a long time. But it had not worked out as planned. It had not worked out as planned because Slade, only hours from the execution chamber, with absolutely nothing to lose, had splattered the guard's brains around the inside of his cell and marched outside with a frightened Marcia Lawrence. Outside the cell block, while other condemned prisoners roared and shouted and banged tin cups on bars and metal walls and Judas hole grills. Outside the prison compound and across the dome-enclosed city which served the prison. Then, outside the dome. Outside the dome there was rock. Rock only, twisted and convoluted and thrusting and gigantic, like monoliths of a race of giants. Rock alone under the awesome grey sky, steaming rock. Some of the terrestrial waters were still trapped at great depths, and the sea far off, booming against rocky headlands, hissing tidally and slowly in an age-long process, pulverizing the rock. The sea far off, a clean sea, not sea-smelling sea, a sea whose waters must evaporate countless times, and be borne up over the naked rocks in vapor and clouds, and come down in pelting endless rain, and rush across the rock, frothing and steaming. A sea which must do this countless times in the eons to come, and would do it to bring salinity to its own waters.
"It kind of scares the hell out of you, doesn't it?"
Adam Slade said. He was a big man with a thick neck and heavy, sleepy-looking eyes, and a blue beard shadow on his stubborn jaw. He said those words as he climbed out of the prison tank with Marcia Lawrence. The tank's metal was still warm from overheated travel. "I didn't think anyone would scare you," Marcia Lawrence said. She had conquered her initial terror in the 5 hours of clanking tank flight from the prison. They'd come a great many miles from the prison dome, paralleling the edge of the saltless sea, and then, finally, when their fuel was almost gone, clanking and rattling down toward the sea. She was a newspaper woman, that above all now. She must not be afraid. She had a story here. A story.
"Get moving," Adam Slade said. "I got nothing against you, lady,"
he told her for the 10th time.
"But you try anything, you're dead. You get that? I got nothing to lose. One time is all that can kill me, but first they gotta find me. But they won't be able to take me as long as you're here. Just stay meek, and you'll stay alive."
How long do you think you can hold out?
Marcia Lawrence asked practically. They had begun to walk away from the now useless tank. Adam Slade was carrying the dead guard's M-gun in the crook of his bent left arm, and walking with long, easy, ground-consuming strides. Marcia almost had to run to keep up with him as they went down a stretch of slightly sloping black rock toward the steaming, hissing, pounding, roaring, exploding surf. Slade smiled.
"Plenty of water," he said.
But no food, Mr. Slade. There is absolutely no food on Earth now, and no possible way of getting food, unless you want to stick around for a few million years.
"You think I came here without a plan?"
Slade asked with some hostility.
I don't know. You were desperate.
"As long as you're with me, I figure they might follow, but they won't rush me. They might even send over a copter, but it won't try anything. Not with you here. Desperate? I'm not desperate, and don't you forget it. Desperate, you don't think straight. Once is all that can execute me. I stay behind, I'd have done it. If they catch me, they'll do it. What's the difference?"
You said you had a plan.
They reached the edge of a thrusting headland, an enormous beak-shaped cliff of beetling black rock which leaned over the young, still saltless ocean. Slade paced back and forth quickly, with a powerful leonine grace, until he found a fault in the rock. The fault tumbled jaggedly, steeply down almost to the edge of the sea.
"Down there," Slade said. "We'll follow the sea coast back to the prison."
"Back?" Marcia said in disbelief.
"Hell yes, back. You said it yourself. There's no food out here. Since there ain't no life, of course there's no food.
Oh, it's a great place for a prison, all right. Whoever thought of it ought to win a prize. A prison 1 billion years in the past. What's the word? Archaeozoic, she supplied. Yeah, archaeozoic. An archaeozoic prison. You can escape to your heart's content, but what the hell's the difference? There's no life back here, not yet. The Earth's just a baby, so you can escape, and you starve to death. It makes every maximum security jail before this one look like a kid's piggy bank. There hasn't ever been an escape, Marcia said hopefully, as they made their way down to the sea, she in front, and Slade behind her with the M-gun. There ain't never been a hostage before. No? There's a hostage now. Marcia Lawrence took a deep breath and asked suddenly, Are you going to kill me? Hell, I don't know. I got no reason to, unless you make me. We're going back there. We're double tracking along the beach, get me? Back to the prison dome. But Adam Slade won't starve to death out here. We'll double back to the dome and the time machine. Oh, she said. They began to walk along the edge of the sea, its waters sullen grey, mirroring the sky. Here, on this dawn earth, the sky has as yet never been blue, for the primordial waters were still falling. Falling. It rained almost all the time, and the air was thick with moisture, and every night when the sun, as yet unseen by the dawn earth, except as an invisible source of light, went down, and darkness came, the mists rolled in from the sea. In the morning, whether rains had fallen or not, the ground was soaked, and tiny freshets rushed down to the sea, returning to it. Look out, he cried suddenly, and shoved her against the base of the cliff which overlooked the water. The cliff top thrust out over them, umbrella-wise. The base of the cliff was thus a concavity, and they pressed themselves against it now, in shadow. The waters of the infant sea were 100 yards away, surging and booming against the rock. She heard it soon after he did. A helicopter. She wanted to scream. She wondered if they would hear her scream, but she looked at Adam Slade's face and did nothing. Soon the helicopter came, buzzing low over them, searching. It circled a great many times because the abandoned tank was there. It circled and came down on the beach, and 2 uniformed figures got out. Now she really wanted to scream. One sound, and they would hear it. One quick filling of the lungs, and Adam Slade hit her suddenly and savagely, and the black loomed up at her, but she did not remember striking it. When she awoke, the helicopter was gone. Sorry I had to poke you one, Slade said. He did not seem sorry at all. He said it automatically, and then added, You ready to walk? She nodded. She got up and staggered a few steps before her legs steadied under her. Then with Slade she walked down along the rocky beach. This, she thought, was a story. It was the only big story she'd ever had, and probably she would not live to write it. As a woman, she was almost hysterical with fear, but as a videocaster she was angry. The story was hers, if she lived to tell it. Then she had to live. Time prison. Sure, she thought. Utterly escape-proof, unless someone like Slade could take a hostage, double back to the prison dome, the hermetically sealed dome, and somehow trick or overpower the guards who watched the time-traveling machine outside the prison dome. Outside. Naturally, it would be outside. That way the prisoners couldn't get at it. Unless, like Slade, they too were outside. Outside, where life had not yet been born. Outside, the infant Earth. Let a man escape. What did his escape matter? He would live exactly as long as it took a man, reasonably healthy, to starve to death. Unless he had a hostage and a plan. She became aware of rain when they left the cliff overhang. There was almost no wind, and the rain came down slowly at first. Huge, slow drops which splattered on the black rock. If it gets any harder, Slade said, we'll have to duck under the cliff for protection. You don't know what a rain can be like back here. I've seen them through the dome. But they couldn't go under the cliff for protection, not if they wanted to keep going, for the cliff dropped suddenly in a wild jumble of rocks, and then there was nothing but the sloping black beach, sloping down to the sea. Then, all at once, somebody opened the sluice gates, and the rain bombarded them. It slapped and bounced off the rock like pistol shots. It struck them like hammers. He staggered under its weight. "We'll have to go back to the cliffs," Marcia cried. She yelled it again at the top of her voice, because she realized Slade would not hear her otherwise, as the rain cracked and exploded and splattered and crashed. There were no droplets of water, for each one had size and shape and weight, swift falling, hammering weight as it came down. Each one, Marcia thought wildly, struggling to keep her feet, was the size of your clenched fist there in the grey dawn of Earth. "The cliffs!" she cried again. But Adam Slade shook his head, grabbed her arm above the waist and pulled her after him. He pointed ahead, in the direction they'd been going. He said nothing. There was no need to talk. They were going forward, and if it killed them, probably Adam Slade did not care much. He wanted that prison time machine for his escape, and he was either going to get it or die in the attempt. They went on slowly. First one would fall, and then the other, and when it was Slade who had fallen, she would wait patiently, hopefully, if he ever released his hold on the M-gun. But if it were Marcia who fell, Slade would yank her to her feet savagely, yelling words which she had heard at first, but which after a while, after an eternity of the storm, seemed to merge with the sound of the rain and the far booming of thunder out over the water, and then, as if by magic, she was walking again, and stumbling along with Slade, drenched and beaten and half drowned. She hardly remembered when night came, but presently she was aware of the darkness and the mist over the sea, and over the rock, and now engulfing them with its white ectoplasmic tendrils. In the mist she knew she could escape Slade, and yet she did not. Without Slade now in the middle of nowhere, there by the sea and the shores of the young Earth, she would die in the storm. With Slade, at least for now, was life. She went on. The thunder followed them and came closer. By the middle of the night, it sounded like artillery at a distance of half a mile, like a barrage of big atomic shells just out of sight behind a black ridgeline which wasn't there. And through the deeper rain-wet darkness of early morning, through the mist, tearing the mist to tatters, shredding it, came the spears and forks and lances of lightning. It was, Marcia thought, a nightmare of a storm, and she must remember it, for it would make a story, a real story if ever she lived to tell it. By morning the air smelled of ozone. It reeked of ozone, and around them, as the grey light seeped out of the wet sky and the rain suddenly slackened as if the weak daylight dispelled it, the black rocks were blasted and broken where lightning had struck. In the dawn's first light, another helicopter came. "Get down!" Slade shouted, and they dropped among the blasted black rocks, hiding there, not moving. The helicopter came on through the slackening rain, buzzing a few 100 feet over them, but not circling. It was heading for the abandoned tank, Marcia thought.
It wasn't looking for them here.
But suddenly the rain came down in all its savage force again, blinding, bounding off the rocks, pounding relentlessly. Overhead, the helicopter seemed to pause like a bird stricken in flight. The rotors whirled a silver shield against the rain, the great drops splattering off the shield, and the helicopter came down under the weight of the rain. It landed 150 yards from them down the beach, and Marcia watched breathlessly while 3 men got out and looked at each other and at the rain. The dawn light was still only a dim grey, and Marcia could not see the men clearly. But abruptly, a jagged spear of lightning-blasted rock midway between where they were hiding and the helicopter, and in the afterglare through the wet and almost crackling air, the men were very clear. And clearer still, when other lightning came down around them, ringing them in, it seemed, like a tent. There was now so much lightning it looked more like an aurora than an electric storm. Dawn Earth, before life, spending itself in fury. All at once Marcia was running down toward the edge of the water where the helicopter was. She ran, screaming and shouting, but the thunder swallowed her puny voice. At every moment she expected Adam Slade to kill her, to merely stand up with the M-gun and shoot her, but he did not, and perhaps her unconscious mind in the instant she had fled had instinctively known he would not, for if Adam Slade killed her, he had no hostage. If he killed her and they found him, he would have absolutely no chance. She turned and looked behind her. There was Slade, silhouetted against the lightning, running, covering the ground in huge strides, gaining on her. She did not look back again. The whole world was lightning and thunder, and her legs striking earth under her, up and down, pounding, running, fleeing, and the rain, Slade's ally, beating her, buffeting her, exploding against her. She stumbled and fell, but she was up and running again in a moment. Now Slade was very close, but the helicopter was close too. She did not think the men there had seen them yet. She waved her arms and screamed, although she knew the screams would not be heard, and then Slade was on her. They went down together, and she knew she was frail and helpless before his great strength. He grabbed her, his hands, angry hands, on her throat, and lightning struck. It bounded and bounced off rock a dozen feet from them. It shook the earth and blasted the rock, and pieces like shrapnel cluttered all around them, and struck them too, and Marcia felt hot blood in her arm, and it was her own blood. But Slade had been momentarily stunned, and she was running again, away from him, but away from the helicopter too. At first she did not realize that, but when she did realize it, it was too late. If she doubled back now, she would rush into Slade's arms. She ran into the sea. It was suddenly, unexpectedly calm. It merely eddied around her ankles, as if waiting for something. The storm seemed to be waiting too, lightning holding back, the thunder stilled, even the rain hanging there in the black, heavy sky, waiting. Slade came after her, stalking through the surf. A single bolt of lightning lanced down at them, and a great, engulfing roar lifted Marcia, carried her, stunned her. And then the rain pelted down again, and the sea was an angry sea, and the air was supercharged with ozone and another smell, like seared flesh. You saw Adam Slade then. Slade was down in a foot of water, face down. It was not moving, and the water lapped around him, over him. She went to him, walking slowly. The men from the helicopter were there too. They had seen in that final flash of lightning.
"Are you all right, miss?"
one of them shouted. "Yes, Slade." They turned him over. They looked at him.
"Dead,"
one of them said. "Dead," she echoed. He would have collapsed, but they caught her. Then the rain really came down, not as it had come before, which was hard enough. It came in huge globes of water, and each globe was as big as your head, and if it hit, it could stun you. "Slade!" someone cried as the globes exploded violently in the surf around them.
"He's dead. He'll keep."
And they went back to the helicopter with Marcia to await the end of the storm there. When it was over, when the sky was not black, but merely the color of lead, they returned down the beach for Slade's body. But Slade wasn't there.
"But he was dead,"
Marcia said incredulously. One of the men smiled.
"He didn't go any place under his own power. He was dead all right. The storm took his body out to sea is all."
They stood there for a moment, gazing out across the black, troubled water of the infant ocean and the infant earth, 1 billion years ago. Slade was out there. Slade, dead. Out there with the tides and the waters and the frequent electric storms.
"Out there, with 1,000,000 bacteriological parasites on his dead body, and in his dead body, which he brought with him," Marcia said dreamily. "What are you talking about, miss?"
Out there in the electric dawn of Earth, with the bacteria which lived in his body as they lived in all other bodies, out there with them, dead. Food for them. Food and water and air heavy with ozone and the electric storms. Marcia laughed hysterically. It was a story she wanted to write, but she wouldn't write it. Slade was a killer, condemned to die. But Slade, dead out there with his bacteria. Slade, evil to man and human society, but not necessarily evil in the implacable ways of nature, or perhaps grimly, terribly evil. Slade out there, dead on the bosom of the primordial waters. Slade back in time 1 billion years before life had been born on Earth. She laughed hysterically as they led her away from the water. They slapped her face, gently at first, then harder. "I'll be all right," she managed to say. She would be all right. She could live to forget it. But Slade out there. Slade. Slade, fathering all life on Earth there in the sea with his dead body. Slade, who had sinned and was taken back here to die for his sins, so that life could be born. Slade, whose first name was Adam. End of story 2. Story 3 of Dastardly Criminals in Space. Edreed Short Sci-Fi, Volume 4. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Watchbird by Robert Sheckley. When Gelson entered, he saw that the rest of the Watchbird manufacturers were already present. There were 6 of them, not counting himself, and the room was blue with expensive cigar smoke. "Hi, Charlie," one of them called as he came in. The rest broke off conversation long enough to wave a casual greeting at him. As a Watchbird manufacturer, he was a member manufacturer of salvation, he reminded himself wryly. Very exclusive. You must have a certified government contract if you want to save the human race. "The government representative isn't here yet," one of the men told him. "He's due any minute."
"We're getting the green light,"
another said. Fine. Gelson found a chair near the door and looked around the room. It was like a convention, or a Boy Scout rally. The 6 men made up for their lack of numbers by sheer volume. The president of Southern Consolidated was talking at the top of his lungs about Watchbird's enormous durability. The 2 presidents he was talking at were grinning, nodding, one trying to interrupt with the results of a test he had run on Watchbird's resourcefulness, the other talking about the new recharging apparatus. The other 3 men were in their own little group, delivering what sounded like panegyric to Watchbird. Gelson noticed that all of them stood straight and tall, like the saviors they felt they were. He didn't find it funny. Up to a few days ago he had felt that way himself. He had considered himself a pot-bellied, slightly balding saint. He sighed and lighted a cigarette. At the beginning of the project, he had been as enthusiastic as the others. He remembered saying to McIntyre, his chief engineer, "Mac, a new day is coming. Watchbird is the answer." And McIntyre had nodded very profoundly. Another Watchbird convert. How wonderful it had seemed then. A simple, reliable answer to one of mankind's greatest problems. All wrapped and packaged in a pound of incorruptible metal, crystal, plastics. Perhaps that was the very reason he was doubting it now. Gelson suspected that you don't solve human problems so easily. There had to be a catch somewhere. After all, murder was an old problem, and Watchbird too new a solution. "Gentlemen," they had been talking so heatedly that they hadn't noticed the government representative entering. Now the room became quiet at once. "Gentlemen," the pumped government man said, "the President, with the consent of Congress, has acted to form a Watchbird division for every city and town in the country." The men burst into a spontaneous shout of triumph. They were going to have their chance to save the world after all, Gelson thought, and worriedly asked himself what was wrong with that. He listened carefully as the government man outlined the distribution scheme. The country was to be divided into 7 areas, each to be supplied and serviced by one manufacturer. This meant monopoly, of course, but a necessary one. Like the telephone service, it was in the public's best interests. You couldn't have competition in Watchbird's service. Watchbird was for everyone. "The President hopes," the representative continued, "that full Watchbird service will be installed in the shortest possible time. It will have top priorities on strategic metals, manpower, and so forth." "Speaking for myself," the president of Southern Consolidated said, "I expect to have the first batch of Watchbirds distributed within the week. Production is all set up." The rest of the men were equally ready. The factories had been prepared to roll out the Watchbirds for months now. The final standardized equipment had been agreed upon, and only the presidential go-ahead had been lacking. "Fine," the representative said. "If that is all, I think we can—" "Is there a question?" "Yes, sir," Gelson said. "I want to know if the present model is the one we're going to manufacture." "Of course," the representative said. "It's the most advanced." "I have an objection." Gelson stood up. His colleagues were glaring coldly at him. Obviously, he was delaying the advent of the Golden Age. "What is your objection?" the representative asked. "First, let me say that I am 100% in favor of machine to stop murder. It's been needed for a long time. I object only to the Watchbird's learning circuits. They serve, in effect, to animate the machine and give it a pseudo-consciousness. I can't approve of that." "But, Mr. Gelson, you yourself testified that the Watchbird would not be completely efficient unless such circuits were introduced."
Without them, the watchbirds could stop only an estimated 70% of murders.
I know that, Gelson said, feeling extremely uncomfortable. I believe there might be a moral danger in allowing a machine to make decisions that are rightfully man's, he declared, doggedly.
Oh, come now, Gelson,
one of the corporation presidents said.
It's nothing of the sort. The watchbird will only reinforce the decisions made by honest men from the beginning of time.
I think that is true, the representative agreed. But I understand how Mr. Gelson feels. It is sad that we must put a human problem into the hands of a machine, sadder still that we must have a machine enforce our laws. But I ask you to remember, Mr. Gelson, that there is no other possible way of stopping a murderer before he strikes. It would be unfair to the many innocent people killed every year if we were to restrict watchbird on philosophical grounds. Don't you agree that I'm right?
Yes, I suppose I do, Gelson said unhappily. He had told himself all that 1,000 times. Something still bothered him. Perhaps he would take it up with McIntyre. As the conference broke up, a thought struck him. He grinned. A lot of policemen were going to be out of work.
Now, what do you think of that? Officer Celtrix demanded. 15 years in homicide and a machine is replacing me.
He wiped a large red hand across his forehead and leaned against the captain's desk.
Ain't science marvelous?
2 other policemen, late of homicide, nodded glumly.
Don't worry about it, the captain said. We'll find a home for you in larceny, Celtrix. You'll like it here. I just can't get over it, Celtrix complained. A lousy little piece of tin and glass is going to solve all the crimes.
Not quite, the captain said. The watchbirds are supposed to prevent the crimes before they happen.
And how'll they be crimes? One of the policemen asked. I mean, they can't hang you for murder until you commit one, can they?
That's not the idea, the captain said. The watchbirds are supposed to stop a man before he commits a murder.
And no one arrests him?
Celtrix asked. I don't know how they're going to work that out, the captain admitted. The man was silent for a while. The captain yawned and examined his watch.
The thing I don't understand,
Celtrix said, still leaning on the captain's desk,
is just how do they do it? How did it start, Captain?
The captain studied Celtrix's face for possible irony. After all, Watchbird had been in the papers for months. But then he remembered that Celtrix, like his sidekicks, rarely bothered to turn past the sports pages. Well, the captain said, trying to remember what he had read in the Sunday supplements.
His scientists were working on criminology. They were studying murderers to find out what made them tick. But they found that murderers throw out a different sort of brainwave from ordinary people. And their glands act funny, too. Now this happens when they're about to commit a murder. So these scientists worked out a special machine to flash red or something when these brainwaves turned on. Scientists, Celtrix said bitterly. Well, after the scientists had this machine, they didn't know what to do with it. It was too big to move around, and murderers didn't drop in often enough to make it flash. So they built it into a smaller unit and tried it out in a few police stations. I think they tried one upstate, but it didn't work so good. You couldn't get to the crime in time. That's why they built the watchbirds.
I don't think they'll stop no crimes, one of the policemen insisted.
They sure will. I read the test results. They can smell him out before he commits a crime, and when they reach him, they give him a powerful shock or something. It'll stop him.
You're closing up homicide, Captain, Celtric asked.
No, the captain said. I'm leaving a skeleton crew in until we see how these birds do.
What?
Celtric said. Skeleton crew? That's funny. Sure, the captain said. Anyhow, I'm going to leave some men on. It seems the birds don't stop all murders.
Why not?
Some murderers don't have these brainwaves, the captain answered, trying to remember what the newspaper article had said. Oh, their glands don't work or something. Which ones don't they stop? Celtrix asked with professional curiosity. I don't know, but I hear they got the damn things fixed, so they're going to stop all of them soon.
How are they working that?
They learn. The watchbirds, I mean, just like people.
You're kidding me.
No.
Well, Celtrix said, I think I'll just keep old Betsy oiled just in case. You can't trust these scientists.
Right.
Birds, Celtrix scoffed. Over the town, the watchbird soared in a long, lazy curve. Its aluminum hide glistened in the morning sun, and dots of light danced on its stiff wings. Silently it flew. Silently, but with all senses functioning. Built-in kinesthetics told the watchbird where it was, and held it in a long search curve. Its eyes and ears operated as one unit, searching, seeking. And then something happened. The watchbird's electronically fast reflexes picked up the edge of a sensation. A correlation sensor tested it, matching it with electrical and chemical data in its memory files. A relay tripped. Down the watchbird spiraled, coming in on the increasingly strong sensation. It smelled the outpouring of certain glands, tasted a deviant brainwave. Fully alerted and armed, it spun banked in the bright morning sunlight. Donnelly was so intent he didn't see the watchbird coming. He had his gun poised, and his eyes pleaded with the big grocer. "Don't come no closer!"
"You lousy little punk," the grocer said, and took another step forward. "Rob me, I'll break every bone in your puny body."
The grocer, too stupid or too courageous to understand the threat of the gun, advanced on the little thief.
"All right,"
Donnelly said in a thorough state of panic.
"All right, sucker, take—"
A bolt of electricity knocked him on his back. The gun went off, smashing a breakfast food display.
"What in hell?"
the grocer asked, staring at the stunned thief. And then he saw a flash of silver wings.
"Well, I'm really damned. Those watchbirds work."
He stared until the wings disappeared in the sky. Then he telephoned the police. The watchbird returned to its search curve. His thinking center correlated the new facts he had learned about murder. Several of these he hadn't known before. The new information was simultaneously flashed to all the other watchbirds, and their information was flashed back to him. New information, methods, definitions were constantly passing between them. Now that the watchbirds were rolling off the assembly line in a steady stream, Gelson allowed himself to relax. A loud, contented hum filled his plant. Orders were being filled on time, with top priorities given to the biggest cities in his area, and working down to the smallest towns.
"All smooth, Chief,"
McIntyre said, coming in the door. He had just completed a routine inspection. "Fine, have a seat." The big engineer sat down and lighted a cigarette.
"We've been working on this for some time," Gelson said, when he couldn't think of anything else.
"We sure have,"
McIntyre agreed. He leaned back and inhaled deeply. He'd been one of the consulting engineers on the original Watchbird. That was 6 years back. He'd been working for Gelson ever since, and the men had become good friends. "The thing I wanted to ask you was this." Gelson paused. He couldn't think how to phrase what he wanted. Instead, he asked, "What do you think of the Watchbirds, Mac?"
"Who, me?"
The engineer grinned nervously. He had been eating, drinking, and sleeping Watchbird ever since its inception. He had never found it necessary to have an attitude.
"Why, I think it's great."
"I don't mean that," Gelson said. He realized that what he wanted was to have someone understand his point of view. "I mean, do you figure there might be some danger in machine thinking?"
"I don't think so, Chief. Why do you ask?"
"Look, I'm no scientist or engineer. I've just handled cost and production and let you boys worry about how. But as a layman, Watchbird is starting to frighten me."
"No reason for that."
"I don't like the idea of the learning circuits."
"But why not?"
Then McIntyre grinned again.
"I know. You're like a lot of people, Chief. Afraid your machines are going to wake up and say, 'What are we doing here? Let's go out and rule the world.' Is that it?"
"Maybe something like that," Gelson admitted.
"No chance of it," McIntyre said. "The Watchbirds are complex, I'll admit, but an MIT calculator is a whole lot more complex, and it hasn't got consciousness."
"No, but the Watchbirds can learn."
"Sure, so can all the new calculators. Do you think they'll team up with the Watchbirds?"
Gelson felt annoyed at McIntyre, and even more annoyed at himself for being ridiculous. It's a fact that the Watchbirds can put their learning into action. No one is monitoring them.
"So that's the trouble,"
McIntyre said. "I've been thinking of getting out of Watchbird." Gelson hadn't realized it until that moment.
"Look, Chief,"
McIntyre said.
"will you take an engineer's word on this?"
"Let's hear it."
"The Watchbirds are no more dangerous than an automobile, an IBM calculator, or a thermometer. They have no more consciousness or volition than those things. The Watchbirds are built to respond to certain stimuli and to carry out certain operations when they receive that stimuli."
"And the learning circuits?"
"You have to have those,"
McIntyre said patiently, as though explaining the whole thing to a 10-year-old.
"The purpose of the Watchbird is to frustrate all murder attempts, right? Well, only certain murderers give out these stimuli. In order to stop all of them, the Watchbird has to search out new definitions of murder and correlate them with what it already knows."
"I think it's inhuman," Gelson said.
"That's the best thing about it. The Watchbirds are unemotional. Their reasoning is non-anthropomorphic. You can't bribe them or drug them. You shouldn't fear them either."
The intercom on Gelson's desk buzzed. He ignored it. "I know all this," Gelson said. "But still, sometimes I feel like the man who invented dynamite. thought it would only be used for blowing up tree stumps. You didn't invent Watchbird. I still feel morally responsible because I manufacture them. The intercom buzzed again, and Gelson irritably punched a button. Reports are in on the first week of Watchbird operations, his secretary told him. How do they look? Wonderful, sir. Send them in 15 minutes. Gelson switched the intercom off and turned back to McIntyre, who was cleaning his fingernails with a wooden match. Don't you think that this represents a trend in human thinking? The mechanical God, the electronic father. Chief, McIntyre said, I think you should study Watchbird more closely. Do you know what's built into the circuits? Only generally. First, there is purpose, which is to stop living organisms from committing murder. 2. Murder may be defined as an act of violence, consisting of breaking, mangling, maltreating, or otherwise stopping the functions of a living organism by a living organism. 3. Most murderers are detectable by certain chemical and electrical changes. McIntyre paused to light another cigarette. Those conditions take care of the routine functions. Then, for the learning circuits, there are 2 more conditions. 4. There are some living organisms who commit murder without the signs mentioned in 3. These can be detected by data applicable to condition 2. I see, Gelson said. You realize how foolproof it is? I suppose so. Gelson hesitated a moment. I guess that's all. Right, the engineer said and left. Gelson thought for a few moments. There couldn't be anything wrong with the watchbirds. Send in the reports, he said into the intercom. High above the lighted buildings of the city, the watchbird soared. It was dark, but in the distance the watchbird could see another, and another beyond that. For this was a large city, to prevent murder. There was more to watch for now. New information had crossed the invisible network that connected all watchbirds. New data, new ways of detecting the violence of murder. There, the edge of a sensation. 2 watchbirds dipped simultaneously. One had received the scent a fraction of a second before the other. He continued down while the other resumed monitoring. Condition 4, there are some living organisms who commit murder without the signs mentioned in Condition 3. Through his new information, the watchbird knew by extrapolation that this organism was bent on murder, even though the characteristic chemical and electrical smells were absent. The watchbird, all senses acute, closed in on the organism. He found what he wanted and dived. Roger Greco leaned against a building, his hands in his pocket. In his left hand was the cool butt of a .45. Greco waited patiently. He wasn't thinking of anything particular, just relaxing against a building, waiting for a man. Greco didn't know why the man was to be killed. He didn't care. Greco's lack of curiosity was part of his value. The other part was his skill. 1 bullet, neatly placed in the head of a man he didn't know. It didn't excite him or sicken him. It was a job, just like anything else. You killed a man. So? As Greco's victim stepped out of a building, Greco lifted the .45 out of his pocket. He released the safety and braced the gun with his right hand. He still wasn't thinking of anything as he took aim, and was knocked off his feet. Greco thought he'd been shot. He struggled up again, looked around, and sighted foggily on his victim. Again, he was knocked down. This time he lay on the ground, trying to draw a bead. He never thought of stopping, for Greco was a craftsman. With the next blow, everything went black, permanently, because the watchbird's duty was to protect the object of violence, at whatever cost to the murderer. The victim walked to his car. He hadn't noticed anything unusual. Everything had happened in silence. Gelson was feeling pretty good. The watchbirds had been operating perfectly. Crimes of violence had been cut in half, and cut again. Dark alleys were no longer mouths of horror. Parks and playgrounds were not places to shun after dark. Of course, there were still robberies. Petty thievery flourished, and embezzlement, larceny, forgery, and 100 other crimes. But that wasn't so important. You could regain lost money, never a lost life. Gelson was ready to admit that he'd been wrong about the watchbirds. They were doing a job that humans had been unable to accomplish. The first hint of something wrong came that morning. McIntyre came into his office. He stood silently in front of Gelson's desk, looking annoyed and a little embarrassed. "What's the matter, Mac?" Gelson asked. "One of the watchbirds went to work on a slaughterhouse man. Knocked him out." Gelson thought about it for a moment. Yes, the watchbirds would do that. With their new learning circuits, they had probably defined the killing of animals as murder. Tell the packers to mechanize their slaughtering, Gelson said. I never liked that business myself. All right, McIntyre said. He pursed his lips, then shrugged his shoulders and left. Gelson stood beside his desk, thinking. Couldn't the watchbirds differentiate between a murderer and a man engaged in a legitimate profession? No, evidently not. To them, murder was murder. No exceptions. He frowned. That might take a little ironing out in the circuits. But not too much, he decided hastily. Just make them a little more discriminating. He sat down and buried himself in paperwork, trying to avoid the edge of an old fear. They strapped the prisoner into the chair and fitted the electrode to his leg. "Oh, oh," he moaned, only half conscious now of what they were doing. They fitted the helmet over his shaved head and tightened the last straps. He continued to moan softly. And then the watchbird swept in. How he had come, no one knew. Prisons are large and strong, with many locked doors, but the watchbird was there, to stop a murder.
"Get the thing out of here!"
The warden shouted and reached for the switch. The watchbird knocked him down.
"Stop that!"
The guard screamed and grabbed for the switch himself. He was knocked to the floor beside the warden.
"This isn't murder, you idiot!"
Another guard said. He drew his gun to shoot down the glittering, whirling metal bird. Anticipating, the watchbird smashed him back against the wall. There was silence in the room. After a while, the man in the helmet started to giggle. Then he stopped. The watchbird stood on guard, fluttering in midair, making sure no murder was done. New data flashed along the watchbird network. Unmonitored, independent, the thousands of watchbirds received and acted upon it. The breaking, mangling, or otherwise stopping the functions of a living organism by a living organism. New acts to stop. "Damn you, get going!" Farmer Hollister shouted and raised his whip again. The horse barked, and the wagon rattled and shook as he edged sideways. "You lousy hunk of pig meal, get going!" the farmer yelled, and he raised the whip again. It never fell. An alert watchbird, sensing violence, had knocked him out of his seat. A living organism? What is a living organism? The watchbirds extended their definitions as they became aware of more facts. And of course, this gave them more work. The deer was just visible at the edge of the woods. The hunter raised his rifle and took careful aim. He didn't have time to shoot. With his free hand, Gelson mopped perspiration from his face. "All right," he said into the telephone. He listened to the stream of vituperation from the other end, then placed the receiver gently in its cradle. "What was that one?" McIntyre asked. He was unshaven, tie loose, shirt unbuttoned. "Another fisherman," Gelson said. "It seems the watchbirds won't let him fish, even though his family is starving. What are we going to do about it, he wants to know." "How many hundred is that?" "I don't know. I haven't opened the mail." "Well, I figured out where the trouble is," McIntyre said gloomily, with the air of the man who knows just how he blew up the Earth, after it was too late. "Let's hear it." "Everybody took it for granted that we wanted all murder stopped. We figured the watchbirds would think as we do. We ought to have qualified the conditions." "I've got an idea," Gelson said. "That we'd have to know just why and what murder is before we could qualify the conditions properly. And if we knew that, we wouldn't need the watchbirds." "Oh, I didn't know about that. They just have to be told that some things which look like murder are not murder." "But why should they stop fishermen?" Gelson asked. "Why shouldn't they? Fish and animals are living organisms. We just don't think that killing them is murder." The telephone rang. Gelson glared at it and punched the intercom. "I told you no more calls, no matter what." "This is from Washington," his secretary said. "I thought you'd—" "Sorry." Gelson picked up the telephone. "Yes, certainly is a mess. Have they? All right, I certainly will." He put down the telephone. "Short and sweet," he told McIntyre. "We're to shut down temporarily." "That won't be so easy," McIntyre said. "The watchbirds operate independent of any central control, you know. They come back once a week for a repair checkup. We'll just have to turn them off then, one by one." "Well, let's get to it. Monroe over on the coast has shut down about a quarter of his birds." "I think I can dupe out a restricting circuit," McIntyre said. "Fine," Gelson replied bitterly. "You make me very happy." The watchbirds were learning rapidly, expanding and adding to their knowledge. Loosely defined abstractions were extended, acted upon, and re-extended, to stop murder. Metal and electrons reason well, but not in a human fashion. A living organism. Any living organism. The watchbirds set themselves the task of protecting all living things. The fly buzzed around the room, lighting on a tabletop, pausing a moment, then darting to a windowsill. The old man stalked it, a rolled newspaper in his hand. Murderer. The watchbird swept down and saved the fly in the nick of time. The old man writhed on the floor a minute, and then was silent. He had been given only a mild shock, but it had been enough for his fluttery, cranky heart. His victim had been saved, though, and this was the important thing. Save the victim, and give the aggressor his just deserts. Gelson demanded angrily, "Why aren't they being turned off?" The assistant control engineer gestured. In a corner of the repair room lay the senior control engineer, who was just regaining consciousness. "He tried to turn one of them off," the assistant engineer said. Both his hands were knotted together. He was making a visible effort not to shake. "It's ridiculous. They haven't got any sense of self-preservation. Then turn them off yourself. Besides, I don't think any more are going to come." What could have happened? Gelson began to piece it together. The watchbirds still hadn't decided on the limits of a living organism. When some of them were turned off in the Monroe plant, the rest must have correlated the data. So they had been forced to assume that they were living organisms as well. No one had ever told them otherwise. Certainly they carried on most of the functions of living organisms. Then the old fears hit him. Gelson trembled and hurried out of the repair room. He wanted to find McIntyre in a hurry. The nurse handed the surgeon the sponge. "Scalpel." She placed it in his hand. He started to make the first incision, and then he was aware of a disturbance. "Who let that thing in?" "I don't know," the nurse said, her voice muffled by the mask. "Get it out of here." The nurse waved her arms at the bright-winged thing, but it fluttered over her head. The surgeon proceeded with the incision, as long as he was able. The watchbird drove him away and stood guard. "Telephone the watchbird company," the surgeon ordered. "Get them to turn the thing off." The watchbird was preventing violence to a living organism. The surgeon stood by helplessly, while his patient died. Fluttering high above the network of highways, the watchbird watched and waited. It had been constantly working for weeks now, without rest or repair. Rest and repair were impossible, because the watchbird couldn't allow itself, a living organism, to be murdered, and that was what happened when watchbirds returned to the factory. There was a built-in order to return after the lapse of a certain time period, but the watchbird had a stronger order to obey: preservation of life, including its own. The definitions of murder were almost infinitely extended now, impossible to cope with, but the watchbird didn't consider that. It responded to its stimuli, whenever they came, whatever their source. There was a new definition of living organism in its memory files. It had come as a result of the watchbird discovery that watchbirds were living organisms, and it had enormous ramifications. The stimuli came. For the 100th time that day, the bird wheeled and banked, dropping swiftly down to stop murder. Jackson yawned and pulled his car to a shoulder of the road. He didn't notice the glittering dot in the sky. There was no reason for him to. Jackson wasn't contemplating murder by any human definition. That was a good spot for a nap, he decided. He had been driving for 7 straight hours, and his eyes were starting to fog. He reached out to turn off the ignition key, and was knocked back against the side of the car.
"What in hell's wrong with you?"
he asked indignantly.
"All I want to do is—"
He reached for the key again, and again he was smacked back. Jackson knew better than to try a third time. He had been listening to the radio and knew what the watchbirds did to stubborn violators.
"You mechanical jerk," he said to the waiting metal bird. "Car's not alive. I'm not trying to kill it."
But the watchbird only knew that a certain operation resulted in stopping an organism. The car was certainly a functioning organism. Wasn't it of metal, as were the watchbirds? Didn't it run? McIntyre said, "Without repairs, they'll run down." He shoved a pile of specification sheets out of his way. "How soon?" Gelson asked.
6 months to a year. Say a year, barring accidents."
"A year," Gelson said. In the meantime, everything is stopping dead. Do you know the latest? What? The watchbirds have decided that the Earth is a living organism. They won't allow farmers to break ground for ploughing. And of course, everything else is a living organism. Rabbits, beetles, flies, wolves, mosquitoes, lions, crocodiles, crows, and smaller forms of life such as bacteria. I knew, McIntyre said. And you tell me they'll wear out in 6 months or a year. What happens now? What are we going to eat in 6 months? The engineer rubbed his chin. We'll have to do something quick and fast. Ecological balance has gone to hell. Fast isn't the word. Instantaneously would be better. Gelson lighted his 35th cigarette for the day. At least I have the bitter satisfaction of saying I told you so, although I'm just as responsible as the rest of the machine-worshipping fools. McIntyre wasn't listening. He was thinking about watchbirds. Like the rabbit plague in Australia. The death rate is mounting, Gelson said. Famine and floods. Can't cut down trees. Doctors can't... What was that you said about Australia? The rabbits, McIntyre repeated. Hardly any left in Australia now. Why? How was it done? Oh, found some kind of germ that attacked only rabbits. I think it was propagated by mosquitoes. Work on that, Gelson said. You might have something. I want you to get on the telephone, ask for an emergency hookup with the engineers of the other companies. Hurry it up. Together you may be able to dope out something. Right, McIntyre said. He grabbed a handful of blank paper and hurried to the telephone.
What did I tell you?
Officer Seltrick said. He grinned at the captain.
Didn't I tell you scientists were nuts?
I didn't say you were wrong, did I?
The captain asked.
No, but you weren't sure.
Well, I'm sure now. You'd better get going. There's plenty of work for you.
I know.
Seltrick drew his revolver from its holster, checked it, and put it back.
Are all the boys back, Captain?
All?
The captain laughed humorlessly.
Homicide has increased by 50%. There's more murder now than there's ever been.
Sure, Seltrick said. The watchbirds are too busy guarding cans and slugging spiders.
He started toward the door, then turned for a parting shot.
Take my word, Captain. Machines are stupid.
The captain nodded. Thousands of watchbirds trying to stop countless millions of murders. A hopeless task. But the watchbirds didn't hope. Without consciousness, they experienced no sense of accomplishment, no fear of failure. Patiently, they went about their jobs, obeying each stimulus as it came. They couldn't be everywhere at the same time, but it wasn't necessary to be. People learned quickly what the watchbirds didn't like and refrained from doing it. It just wasn't safe. With their high speed and super-fast senses, the watchbirds got around quickly. And now they meant business. In their original directives, there had been a provision made for killing a murderer, if all other means failed. Why spare a murderer? It backfired. The watchbirds extracted the fact that murder and crimes of violence had increased geometrically since they had begun operation. This was true because their new definitions increased the possibilities of murder. But to the watchbirds, the rise showed that the first methods had failed. Simple logic. If A doesn't work, try B. The watchbirds, shocked to kill. Slaughterhouses in Chicago stopped, and cattle starved to death in their pens because farmers in the Midwest couldn't cut hay or harvest grain. No one had told the watchbirds that all life depends on carefully balanced murders. Starvation didn't concern the watchbirds, since it was an act of omission. Their interest lay only in acts of commission. Hunters sat home, glaring at the silver dots in the sky, longing to shoot them down, but for the most part, they didn't try. The watchbirds were quick to sense the murder intent and to punish it. Fishing boats swung idle at their moorings in San Pedro and Gloucester. Fish were living organisms. Farmers cursed and spat and died, trying to harvest the crop. Grain was alive and thus worthy of protection. Potatoes were as important to the watchbird as any other living organism. The death of a blade of grass was equal to the assassination of a president. To the watchbirds. And of course, certain machines were living. This followed, since the watchbirds were machines and living. God help you if you maltreated your radio. Turning it off meant killing it. Obviously, its voice was silenced. The red glow of its tubes faded. It grew cold. The watchbirds tried to guard their other charges. Wolves were slaughtered trying to kill rabbits. Rabbits were electrocuted trying to eat vegetables. Creepers were burned out in the act of strangling trees. A butterfly was executed, caught in the act of outraging a rose. This control was spasmodic because of the fewness of the watchbirds. 1 billion watchbirds couldn't have carried out the ambitious project set by the thousands. The effect was of a murderous force, 10,000 bolts of irrational lightning raging around the country, striking 1,000 times a day. Lightning which anticipated your moves and punished your intentions.
"Gentlemen, please," the government representative begged. "We must hurry."
The 7 manufacturers stopped talking.
"Before we begin this meeting formally," the president of Monroe said, "I want to say something. We do not feel ourselves responsible for this unhappy state of affairs. It was a government project. The government must accept the responsibility, both moral and financial."
Gelson shrugged his shoulders. It was hard to believe that these men, just a few weeks ago, had been willing to accept the glory of saving the world. Now they wanted to shrug off the responsibility when the salvation went amiss.
"I'm positive that need not concern us now," the representative assured him. "We must hurry. Your engineers have done an excellent job. I am proud of the cooperation you have shown in this emergency. You are hereby empowered to put the outlined plan into action."
"Wait a minute," Gelson said.
"There is no time."
"The plan's no good."
"Don't you think it'll work?"
"Of course it'll work, but I'm afraid the cure will be worse than the disease." The manufacturers looked as though they would have enjoyed throttling Gelson. He didn't hesitate. "Haven't we learned yet?" he asked. "Don't you see that you can't cure human problems by mechanization?"
"Mr. Gelson," the president of Monroe said, "I would enjoy hearing you philosophize, but unfortunately people are being killed. Crops are being ruined. There is famine in some sections of the country already. The watchbirds must be stopped at once.
Murder must be stopped, too. I remember all of us agreeing on that. But this is not the way."
"What would you suggest?"
the representative asked. Gelson took a deep breath. What he was about to say took all the courage he had. "Let the watchbirds run down by themselves," Gelson suggested. There was a near riot. The government representative broke it up. "Let's take our lesson," Gelson urged. "Admit that we were wrong trying to cure human problems by mechanical means. Start again. Use machines, yes, but not as judges and teachers and fathers."
"Ridiculous," the representative said coldly. "Mr. Gelson, you are overwrought. I suggest you control yourself."
He cleared his throat.
"All of you are ordered by the president to carry out the plan you have submitted."
He looked sharply at Gelson.
"Not to do so will be treason."
"I'll cooperate to the best of my ability," Gelson said.
"Good. Those assembly lines must be rolling within the week."
Gelson walked out of the room alone. Now he was confused again. Had he been right, or was he just another visionary? Certainly he hadn't explained himself with much clarity. Did he know what he meant? Gelson cursed under his breath. He wondered why he couldn't ever be sure of anything. Weren't there any values he could hold on to? He hurried to the airport and to his plant. The watchbird was operating erratically now. Many of its delicate parts were out of line, worn by almost continuous operation. But gallantly it responded when the stimuli came. A spider was attacking a fly. The watchbird swooped down to the rescue. Simultaneously it became aware of something overhead. The watchbird wheeled to meet it. There was a sharp crackle, and a powerbolt whizzed by the watchbird's wing. Angrily it spat a shockwave. The attacker was heavily insulated. Again it spat at the watchbird. This time a bolt smashed through a wing. The watchbird darted away, but the attacker went after it in a burst of speed, throwing out more crackling power. The watchbird fell, but managed to send out its message. Urgent. A new menace to living organisms, and this was the deadliest yet. Other watchbirds around the country integrated the message. Their thinking centers searched for an answer. "Well, Chief, they bagged 50 today," McIntyre said, coming into Gelson's office. "Fine," Gelson said, not looking at the engineer. "Not so fine." McIntyre sat down. "Lord, I'm tired. It was 72 yesterday." "I know." On Gelson's desk were several dozen lawsuits, which he was sending to the government with a prayer. "They'll pick up again, though," McIntyre said confidently. "The Hawks are especially built to hunt down watchbirds. They're stronger, faster, and they've got better armor. We really rolled them out in a hurry, huh?" "We sure did." "The watchbirds are pretty good, too," McIntyre had to admit. "They're learning to take cover. They're trying a lot of stunts. Each one that goes down tells the others something." Gelson didn't answer. "But anything the watchbirds can do, the Hawks can do better," McIntyre said cheerfully. "The Hawks are special learning circuits for hunting.
They're more flexible than the watchbirds.
They learn faster.
Gelson gloomily stood up, stretched and walked to the window. The sky was blank. Looking out, he realized that his uncertainties were over. Right or wrong, he'd made up his mind. "Tell me," he said, still watching the sky, "what will the hawks hunt after they get all the watchbirds?" "Huh?" McIntyre said. "Why?" "Just to be on the safe side, you'd better design something to hunt down the hawks. Just in case, I mean." "You think?" "All I know is that the hawks are self-controlled. So were the watchbirds. Remote control would have been too slow," the argument went on. "The idea was to get the watchbirds and get them fast. That meant no restricting circuits." "We could dope something out," McIntyre said uncertainly. "You've got an aggressive war machine up in the air now, a murder machine. Before that it was an anti-murder machine. Your next gadget will have to be even more self-sufficient, won't it?" McIntyre didn't answer. "I don't hold you responsible," Gelson said. "It's me. It's everyone." In the air outside was a swift-moving dot. "That's what comes," said Gelson, "of giving a machine the job that was our own responsibility." Overhead, a hawk was zeroing in on a watchbird. The armored murder machine had learned a lot in a few days. Its sole function was to kill. At present, it was impelled toward a certain type of living organism, metallic like itself. But the hawk had just discovered that there were other types of living organisms too, which had to be murdered. End of story 3.
Story 4 of Dastardly Criminals in Space. Ed Reed's Short Sci-Fi, Volume 4. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Incomplete Theft by Ralph Burke. Torlin Kai smiled grimly to himself as he thought of the approaching completion of the new Earth spaceship. Thus far, his disguise had completely fooled the Earthmen. He didn't even begin to suspect that a Valdorian spy was among the engineers who were building the Skyjumper. High above the space field it loomed, a great sphere of metal that housed the new teleportation drive. Torlin Kai looked up at its impressive bulk. Unlike the common type of spaceship, which had a top speed of 10,000 lights, the new drive could take the ship from Earth to any point in the galaxy in a fraction of a microsecond. If it were successful, Earth would win the war against Valdor in a matter of months. And if not... John Mitchell, the chief engineer of Sahara Spaceport, said, "She's a beauty, isn't she, Pete?" Torlin Kai, in his disguise as Earthman Peter Blaine, smiled and said, "Yes, she's a real beauty. When will she be finished?" "This afternoon," Mitchell said. "The boys are tightening the last bolts and putting in the final wiring now. The job's just about over, Pete." Good, thought Torlin. I'll be able to take it tonight. To be able to bring both the spaceship's plans and the ship itself back to Valdor would be a major feat. It would result in a fine promotion. The ship was entirely different from any other vessel ever built. The hyperkinetic generator in its center generated a spherical force field around the ship, which protected it wherever it had been aimed for. It was simple to operate. All the pilot had to do was set up the coordinates of his target, turn on the hyperkinetic generator, and press the activator button. The generator itself did the rest. The field enclosed the ship, and instantaneously the ship was 100 or 1,000 light years away. That evening, Torlin Kai stepped out of his room and strolled over toward the spaceship. It was surrounded by guards, and it was bathed in the blaze of a battery of searchlights. But that did not bother the Valdorian. Earthmen were such stupid fools. It would be a blessing for them if the Valdorians took them over and showed them how to run their lives efficiently. On Valdor, everyone had a job, and he did it. He obeyed his superiors without asking questions, and the society, therefore, was efficient. But these Earthmen, such a lax, sloppy, inefficient society. They needed more regimentation, more precision. They needed to learn to obey orders, and they would learn after the Valdorian victory.
"Evening, Mr. Mitchell."
"Good evening, Captain. Nice night, isn't it?"
Torlin Kai looked around warily and saw the lean, spare figure of John Mitchell standing some distance away. He was talking to a man in a military uniform,
one of the guards posted on the project. The Valdorian ducked away. He didn't care to be seen. Not tonight, of all nights. He walked all around the spaceship, studying it carefully from all angles, keeping well out of sight of the guards that surrounded it. The ship appeared to be ready to go. All he had to do was get inside and take off. Simple. Very simple, Torlin Kai thought. The greatest victories are always simple. The ship was supposed to be lifted above the atmosphere on her jets before the hyperkinetic generator was used, but the generator could, in an emergency, be used on the ground. Torlin Kai smiled. As far as he was concerned, this would be an emergency. The Earthmen, he thought pleasantly, would feel very foolish when their greatest ship simply vanished from under their noses. After making a thorough reconnaissance of the area, the Valdorian decided he was ready. He switched on the tiny power pack at his waist, and the invisibility belt he was wearing was energized. If anyone had been watching the shadows where Torlin Kai was standing, they would have seen a faint blue glow as the Valdorian faded slowly from sight. Then, boldly, the alien strode toward the skyjumper. Nothing stood in the way of success now. He walked directly across the well-lighted safety area, and the guards paid not the slightest attention. At the airlock door, he paused to take stock of the situation. He had to move fast now. The success of the whole mission depended on timing from here on out. The guards, naturally, would see the airlock door swing open. They would know something was wrong. It would take them, he estimated, about 4 minutes to bring up heavy armament to blast the door open. Moistening his lip nervously, he decided to correct the estimate. Better make it 3 minutes for safety's sake, he thought. In that time, he would have to warm up the generator and punch the coordinates for the planet Valdor into the big guiding computer. Doing that would require, say, 2 minutes, giving him a minute's leeway. Good. He waited until the guards all seemed to be looking away from the airlock door. Then he pressed the lock. The door swung open, and Torlin Kai stepped quickly inside. There was a shout from one of the guards below, but they were too late to do anything. The Valdorian had the airlock door closed before they could see what had happened. He turned the master switch on the inside of the door, which locked the door against any outside interference. He grinned sardonically. The fool Earthmen would have a devil of a time doing anything now. The next thing was to switch off his invisibility belt. It was difficult to do delicate work if you couldn't see your own arms and fingers, and punching coordinates into a computer was a delicate job. He turned toward the inner door, and at that moment the door opened. An Earthman stepped out, an engineer named Harris, who had apparently been making some last-minute adjustments on the ship. "Oh, hello, Blaine," Harris said. Without a word, the Valdorian leaped forward, taking the Earthman by surprise. He slammed his fist into Harris's abdomen, and he doubled up in pain. Torlin Kai jumped back as the Earthman's foot suddenly sliced toward him. The toe of the engineer's foot hit him stingingly alongside the jaw, but the Valdorian managed to grasp the foot and twist. Then he bent and picked Harris up, and knocked him down again with a crashing blow to the chin. He left the unconscious Earthman on the floor, locking him inside the airlock. There would be no trouble there. The real trouble was that the fight had delayed his timing. It must have taken all of a minute, and in a split-second operation such as this, an interval of a minute could be fatal. Without wasting any more time, he got moving. His jaw hurt where the Earthman had slugged him, and his fingers felt stiff. He ran down the corridor to the control room. The big automatic computer was ready to go. Torlin Kai switched it on, waited for a moment, and then hastily began punching coordinates into the computer. He had to hurry. The Earthmen might blast their way into the ship at any moment. Still, he dared not make an error. If he did, the ship might end up 1,000 light-years from where it was supposed to materialize, perhaps in the heart of a sun. There was perspiration dripping from his brow by the time he was finished. He turned on the hyperkinetic generator and waited for it to warm up. Still, there was no sound from the airlock. A red indicator light on the control panel came on, telling him that the generator was ready. With a triumphant smile, Torlin Kai reached out and pressed the activator stud. Outside the ship, the guards watched the airlock door.
"I wonder why Dr. Harris did that,"
said the lieutenant. "Who knows?" the sergeant replied. They had seen the airlock open and close, but knowing that Harris was still inside, They had thought little of it. Still, it was odd. The airlock door swung open again. Harris stepped out, looking dazed. The lieutenant ran toward him, and quickly the engineer explained what had happened.
"You mean he's inside there? We've got to stop him."
"It's too late," Harris said. "He didn't know that I was doing some adjusting inside there. Go ahead and look." The lieutenant went to the inner door of the airlock and peered in. The whole inside of the ship was gone, vanished, as though it had never been.
"I just made a slight adjustment to the generator," Harris said quietly. "The power field was cut down, so the projector field was smaller. I'm afraid our spy simply projected the inside of the spaceship out into interstellar vacuum and left the hull behind."
He shook his head grimly.
"Poor devil. He'll have quite a surprise in store for him, unless he can live without air."
End of story 4. Story 5 of Dastardly Criminals in Space. Red Reed Short Sci-Fi, Volume 4. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. An Incident on Route 12 by James H. Schmitz. He was already a thief, prepared to steal again. He didn't know that he himself was only booty. Phil Garfield was 30 miles south of the little town of Redmond on Route 12 when he was startled by a series of sharp clanking noises. They came from under the Packard's hood. The car immediately began to lose speed. Garfield jammed down the accelerator, had a sense of sick helplessness at the complete lack of response from the motor. The Packard rolled on, getting rid of its momentum, and came to a stop. Phil Garfield swore shakily. He checked his watch, switched off the headlights, and climbed out into the dark road. A delay of even half an hour here might be disastrous. It was past midnight, and he had another 110 miles to cover to reach the small private airfield where Matt waited for him and the $30,000 in the suitcase on the Packard's front seat if he didn't make it before daylight. He thought of the bank guard. The man had made a clumsy play at being a hero, and that had set off the fool woman who'd run screaming into the line of fire. One dead, perhaps two. Garfield hadn't stopped to look at an evening paper, but he knew they were hunting for him. He glanced up and down the road. No other headlights in sight at the moment, no light from a building showing on the forested hills. He reached back into the car and brought out the suitcase, his gun, a big flashlight, and the box of shells which had been standing beside the suitcase. He broke the box open, shoved a handful of shells on the .38 into his coat pocket, then took suitcase and flashlight over to the shoulder of the road and set them down. There was no point in groping about under the Packard's hood. When it came to mechanics, Phil Garfield was a moron, and well aware of it. The car was useless to him now, except as bait. But as bait, it might be useful. Should he leave it standing where it was? No, Garfield decided. To anybody driving past, it would merely suggest a necking party or a drunk sleeping off his load before continuing home. He might have to wait an hour or more before someone decided to stop. He didn't have the time.
He reached in through the window, hauled the top of the steering wheel towards him, and put his weight against the rear window frame. The Packard began to move slowly backwards at a slant across the road. In a minute or two he had it in position, not blocking the road entirely, which would arouse immediate suspicion, but angled across it, lights out, empty, both front doors open, and inviting a passerby's investigation. Garfield carried the suitcase and flashlight across the right-hand shoulder of the road and moved up among the trees and undergrowth of the slope above the shoulder. Placing the suitcase between the bushes, he brought out the .38, clicked the safety off, and stood waiting. Some 10 minutes later, a set of headlights appeared speeding up Route 12 from the direction of Redmond. Phil Garfield went down on one knee before he came within range of the lights. Now he was completely concealed by the vegetation. The car slowed as it approached, braking nearly to a stop 60 feet from the stalled Packard. There were several people inside it. Garfield heard voices, then a woman's loud laugh. The driver tapped his horn inquiringly twice, moved the car slowly forward. As the headlights went past him, Garfield got to his feet among the bushes, took a step down towards the road, raising the gun. Then he caught the distant gleam of a second set of headlights approaching from Redmond. He swore under his breath and dropped back out of sight. The car below him reached the Packard, edged cautiously around it, rolled on with a sudden roar of acceleration. The second car stopped when still 100 yards away, the Packard caught in the motionless glare of its lights. Garfield heard the steady purring of a powerful motor. For almost a minute, nothing else happened. Then the car came gliding smoothly on, stopped again no more than 30 feet to Garfield's left. He could see it now through the screening bushes. A big job, a long, low four-door sedan. The motor continued to purr. After a moment, a door on the far side of the car opened and slammed shut. A man walked quickly out into the beam of the headlights and started towards the Packard. Phil Garfield rose from his crouching position, the .38 in his right hand, flashlight in his left. If the driver was alone, the thing was now cinched. But if there was somebody else in the car, somebody capable of fast, decisive action, a slip in the next 10 seconds might cost him the sedan, and quite probably his freedom and life. Garfield lined up the .38's sight steadily on the center of the approaching man's head. He let his breath out slowly as the fellow came level with him in the road, and squeezed off one shot. Instantly he went bounding down the slope to the road. The bullet had flung the man sideways to the pavement. Garfield darted past him to the left, crossed the beam of the headlights, and was in darkness again on the far side of the road, snapping on his flashlight as he sprinted up to the car. The motor hummed quietly on. The flashlight showed the seats empty. Garfield dropped the light, jerked both doors open in turn, gun pointing into the car's interior. Then he stood still for a moment, weak and almost dizzy with relief. There was no one inside. The sedan was his. The man he had shot through the head lay face down on the road, his hat flung a dozen feet away from him. Route 12 still stretched out in dark silence to east and west. There should be time enough to clean up the job before anyone else came along. Garfield brought the suitcase down and put it on the front seat of the sedan, then started back to get his victim off the road and out of sight. He scaled the man's hat into the bushes, bent down, grasped the ankles, and started to haul him towards the left side of the road where the ground dropped off sharply beyond the shoulder. The body made a high squealing sound and began to writhe violently. Shocked, Garfield dropped the legs and hurriedly took the gun from his pocket, moving back a step. The squealing noise rose in intensity as the wounded man quickly flopped over twice like a struggling fish, arms and legs soaring about with startling energy. Garfield clicked off the safety, pumped 3 shots into his victim's back. The grisly squeals ended abruptly. The body continued to jerk for another second or two, then lay still. Garfield shoved the gun back into his pocket. The unexpected interruption had unnerved him. His hands shook as he reached down again for the stranger's ankles. Then he jerked his hands back and straightened up, staring. From the side of the man's chest, a few inches below the right arm, something like a thick black stick, 3 feet long, protruded now through the material of the coat. It shone, gleaming wetly in the light from the car. Even in that first uncomprehending instant, something in its appearance brought a surge of sick disgust to Garfield's throat. Then the stick bent slowly halfway down its length, forming a sharp angle,
and its tip opened into what could have been 3 blunt black claws which scrabbled clumsily against the pavement. Very faintly, the squealing began again, and the body's back arched up as if another stick-like arm were pushing desperately against the ground beneath it. Garfield acted in a blur of horror. He emptied the .38 into the thing at his feet, almost without realizing he was doing it. Then, dropping the gun, he seized one of the ankles, ran backwards to the shoulder of the road, dragging the body behind him. In the darkness at the edge of the shoulder, he let go of it, stepped around to the other side, and with 2 frantically savage kicks, sent the body plunging over the shoulder and down the steep slope beyond. He heard it crash through the bushes for some seconds, then stop. He turned and ran back to the sedan, scooping up his gun as he went past. He scrambled into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut behind him. His hands shook violently on the steering wheel as he pressed down the accelerator. The motor roared into life, and the big car surged forward. He edged it past the Packard, cursing aloud in horrified shock, jammed down the accelerator, and went flashing up Route 12, darkness racing beside and behind him. What had it been? Something that wore what seemed to be a man's body like a suit of clothes, moving the body as a man moves, driving a man's car, roach-armed, roach-legged itself. Garfield drew a long, shuddering breath. Then, as he slowed for a curve, there was a spark of reddish light in the rearview mirror. He stared at the spark for an instant, braced the car to a stop, rolled down the window, and looked back. Far behind him, along Route 12, a fire burned, approximately at the point where the Packard had stalled out, where something had gone rolling off the road into the bushes. Something, Garfield added mentally, that found fiery automatic destruction when death came to it, so that its secrets would remain unrevealed. But for him the fire meant the end of a nightmare. He rolled the window up, took out a cigarette, lit it, and pressed the accelerator. In incredulous fright, he felt the nose of the car tilt upwards, headlights sweeping up from the road into the trees. Then the headlights winked out. Beyond the windshield, dark tree branches floated down towards him, the night sky beyond. He reached frantically for the door handle. A steel wrench clamped silently about each of his arms, drawing them in against his sides, immobilizing them there. Garfield gasped, looked up at the mirror, and saw a pair of faintly gleaming red eyes watching him from the rear of the car. 2 of the things. The second one stood behind him out of sight, holding him. They'd been in what had seemed to be the trunk compartment, and they had come out. The eyes in the mirror vanished. A moist, black roach arm reached over the back of the seat beside Garfield, picked up the cigarette he had dropped, extinguished it with rather horribly human motions, then took up Garfield's gun and drew back out of sight. He expected a shot, but none came. One doesn't fire a bullet through the suit one intends to wear. It wasn't until that thought occurred to him that tough Bill Garfield began to scream. He was still screaming minutes later when, beyond the windshield, the spaceship floated into view among the stars. End of Story 5. Story 6 of Dastardly Criminals In Space. Ed Reed Short Sci-Fi, Volume 4. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Barbarians by Tom Godwin. Tal Karanth, Supreme Executive of Tharnar, signed the paper and dropped it into the outgoing slot of the message dispatch tube. It was an act that would terminate 180 days of studying the tapes and records on the Terran ship, and would set the final hearing of the Terran man and woman for that day. And, since the Terrans were guilty, their execution would take place before the sun rose again on Tharnar. He went to the wide windows which had automatically opened with the coming of the day's warmth, and looked out across the city. The city had a name, to be found in the books and tapes of history, but for 50,000 years it had been known as the city. It was the city of all cities, the center and soul of Tharnarian civilization. It was a city of architectural beauty,
of flowered gardens and landscaped parks, a city of 500 centuries of learning, a city of eternal peace. The gentle summer breeze brought the sweet scent of the flowering lanna trees through the window, and the familiar sound of the city as it went about its day's routine. A sound soft and unhurried, like a slow whisper. Peace for 50,000 years. Peace and the unhurried quiet. It would always be so for the city. The supreme executives of the past had been chosen for their ability to ensure the safety of the city, and so had he. He turned away from the window and back to his desk to brush his hand across the gleaming metal top of it. No faintest scratch marred the eternalized surface, although the desk had been there for more than 30,000 years. It was permanent and never-changing, like the robot-operated fleet that guarded Dana, like the white and massive executive building, like the way of life on Dana. The Terrans would have to die, lest the peace and the way of life on Dana be destroyed. They were of a young race, a race so young that his desk had already been in place for 15,000 years when they began emerging from their caves. They were a dangerously immature race. It had been only 300 years since their last war with themselves. 300 years. 3 normal Thanarian lifetimes. And the Thanarians had not known war for 600 lifetimes. A race so young could not possess a civilized culture. The Terrans were, he searched for a suitable description, barbarians in spaceships. They lacked the refinement and wisdom of the Thanarians. They were a dangerous and unpredictable race. It could be seen in their history, could be seen in the way the 2 Terrans had reacted to their capture. He pressed one of the many buttons along the edge of his desk, and a 3-dimensional projection appeared. The scene that had taken place 180 days before, when the Terrans were brought to Thana. The ship of the Terrans stood bright silver in the sunlight, slim and graceful against the bulk of the executive building behind it. The Terrans descended the boarding ramp, the left wrist of the man chained to the right wrist of the girl. 2 armed robots walked behind them, their faces metallically impassive, and 4 armed Thanarian guards waited at the bottom of the ramp to help take the Terrans to their place of imprisonment. The Terrans approached the guards with a watchfulness that reminded him of the old films of the coast wolves that had once lived on Vendel. They did not walk with the studied, practiced leisure of the Thanarians, but as though they held some unknown vitality barely in check. The face of the man was lean and hard, the black eyes inscrutable as flint. The girl looked at the guards with a bold nonchalance, as though they were really not formidable at all. Somehow, by contrast with the Terrans, the guards appeared to be not grimly vigilant, but only colorless. There seemed to be a menace in the way the man watched the guards. There was the impression that he would overpower them and seize their weapons if given a shadow of a chance. And the girl, what would she do then? Would she flash in beside him to help him, as the female coast wolves always helped their mates? He switched off the projection, feeling a little repugnance at the thought of executing the Terrans. They were living, sentient beings, and intelligent for all their lack of civilization. It would have been better if they had been of some repulsive and alien physical form, such as bloated, many-legged giant insects. But they were not at all repulsive. They were exactly like the Thanarians. He shook his head. Not exactly. The similarity was only to the eye, and not even to the eye when one looked closely, as he had looked at the images. There was a potential violence about them, lurking close beneath their deceptively Thanarian physical appearance. The Terrans were not like the Thanarians. There was a difference of 50,000 years between them, the difference between savage barbarianism and a great and peaceful civilization. He looked again across the city, listening to its softly murmuring voice. In hundreds of centuries the city had known no strife or violence. But what if the barbarians should come?
Not 2 of them, but thousands. What would they do? He was sure he knew what they would do to the gentle, peaceful city, and the faint twinge of remorse at the thought of executing the Terran man and girl paled into insignificance. Under no circumstance could they be permitted to live and tell the others of Tharnar in the city. Bob Randall shifted his position a little in the wide seat, and the chain that linked his wrist with Virginia's rattled metallically, sounding unduly loud in the quiet of the room. Virginia's black hair brushed his cheek as she turned her face up to him to ask in a whisper so low it could not be heard by the 4 guards who stood beside and behind them. "It's almost over, isn't it?" He nodded, as she turned her attention back to the 5 judges, seated at the row of 5 desks before them. The grey-haired one at the center desk, Bob knew, was the one in charge of the proceedings, and his name was Vortigall. He had gained the knowledge by watching and listening, and it was the only information he had acquired. He did not know the names of the other 4 judges, not even for sure that they were judges, and that it was a trial. There had been no introductions by the Thanarians, no volunteering of information. Vortigall spoke to them. "Yes, in fact, the facts are these. You claim that your mission was of a scientific nature, that the 2 of you were sent from Earth to try to reach the center of the galaxy, where you hoped to find data concerning the creation of the galaxy. Your ship carried only the 2 of you, and is one of several such ships sent out on such missions. Since the voyages of these small exploration ships were expected to require an indefinite number of years, and since the occupants would have to endure each other's company for those years, your government thought it more feasible to let the crew of each ship consist of a man and a woman, rather than 2 men. He saw Virginia's cheek quiver at the words, but she managed to restrain the smile. "Our system was reached in your journey," Vortigall continued, "and you swung inside to investigate our sister planet, Vendal. You were met by a guard ship before reaching Vendal, and it fired upon you. Instead of turning back, you destroyed it with a tight beam adaptation of your meteor disintegrator." Vortigall waited questioningly, and Bob said, "Our instruments showed us that the guard ship was robot-operated. They could discern nothing organic in the ship, nothing alive. The same instruments showed us that this planet, Vandal, possessed operating mines and factories, and no organic life other than small animals. We know that machines neither voluntarily build factories nor reproduce other machines, yet the mines and factories were operating. We thought it might be a world where the inhabitants had all died for some reason, and the robots were still following the production orders given them when the race lived." "And so you willfully destroyed the guard ship that would have turned you back?" "We did. It was a machine operated by machines, and so far as we knew, it was protecting a race that had died 1,000 years before. It was all a mystery, and we wanted to find the answer to it." Vortigall and the others accepted the explanation without change of expression. Vortigall resumed. 3 more guard ships appeared when you were near Vendal. In the battle that followed, you severely damaged one of them, and when your ship was finally caught in the guard cruiser's tractor beams, you resisted the robots. When they boarded your ship, you destroyed several of them, and were subdued only when the compartments of your ship were flooded with a disabling gas." "That's true," Bob said. "In summary, you deliberately invaded Thanarian territory, deliberately damaged and destroyed Thanarian ships, and would have landed on Vendal had the guard ships not prevented it. Your guilt is both evident and admitted. Are there any extenuating circumstances that have not been presented at this hearing?" "No," Bob said. None had been presented all day, for the good reason that there was not a single factor of the circumstances that the Thanarians would consider extenuating. "Your guilt was evident from the beginning," Vortigall said. "We have spent the past 180 days in studying the books and tapes on your ship. What we learned of your history and your form of civilization leaves us no alternative in the sentence we must pass upon you." The chain clinked faintly as Virginia lifted her hand to lay it on his arm, and she gave him a quick glance that said, "Here it comes." Vortigall pronounced sentence upon them. "Tomorrow morning, at 3312 time, you will both be put to death by a robot firing squad. Virginia's breath stopped for a moment, and her hand gripped his arm with sudden pressure, but she gave no other indication of emotion, and her eyes did not waver from Vortigall's face. Vortigall looked past her to the guards. "Return them to their shell." The guards produced another chain to link their free arms together behind their backs, and they were marched across the room and out the door. Outside, the sun was setting, already invisible behind a low-lying cloud. Bob calculated the designated time of their execution in relation to the Terran time, as given by his watch, and found that 3312 would be about halfway between daylight and sunrise. Tal Coranth stood by the open windows and watched the guards return the Terrans to their cell. Extra guards, both robot and Thanarian, had been posted inside and outside the prison building for the night to prevent any possibility of an escape. Other robots stood guard around the Terran ship, although it was inconceivable that the Terrans could ever overpower the prison guards and reach their ship. But it had been inconceivable that a ship as small as the Terran ship could ever destroy a Thanarian guard cruiser. The tight beam adaptation circuit of the meteor disintegrators was very ingenious. Why had the Thanarian cruisers not had the same weapon? They possessed the same general type of meteor disintegrators. The same adaptation circuit would transform a Thanarian cruiser's meteor disintegrators into terrible weapons. Why had no one ever thought of doing such a thing? Why had it been taken for granted for 50,000 years that the cruiser's blasters were the ultimate in weapons? What other weapons did the Terrans on Earth possess? How invincible would their cruisers be if a small exploration ship could destroy a Thanarian cruiser? The captive Terrans could not be permitted to return to Earth until the others of Tharnar. Neither could they be permitted to live out their lives in prison on Tharnar. Some day, somehow, they might escape and return to Earth, or send a message to Earth. The robot fleet of Tharnar could never withstand an attack by a Terran fleet. The fate of Tharnar and the quiet and gentle city would be written in blood and dust and ashes. There was the sound of rubber-padded metal feet in the distance, and he saw 6 more robots marching out to add their numbers to the robots already guarding the Terran ship. The ship itself was not far from the executive building, close enough that his eyes, still sharp despite his 70 years, could make out the name on it. The Cat. And a cat was, he recalled the definition, to be found among the Terran books. Any of various species of carnivorous and predatory animals noted for their stealth and quickness, and their ferocity when angered. The robot shoved the plastic food tray under the cell door and went back down the corridor. Virginia turned away from the single window where the cat could be seen as a silhouette merging into the darkness. "Last supper, Bob," she said. "Let's eat, drink, and be merry." He went to the door to get the tray, and noticed the 3 robots and 2 Thanarian guards down the left-hand stretch of corridor, and the same number down the right. Virginia came up beside and said, "They're not taking any chances. We won't be here in the morning, are they?" "No," he said, picking up the tray. "None to speak of." He carried the tray to the little table in the center of the room, and Virginia seated herself across from him, as she had done each meal for the past 6 months. But she toyed with the plastic spoon, and did not begin to eat at once. "I wonder why they made it a firing squad," she asked. "You'd think they would have used something ultra-civilized and refined, such as some painless and flower-scented gas." "Spies were executed with firing squads during the last Terran War, 300 years ago," he said. He smiled thinly. "I suppose they consider us spies and want us to feel at home in the morning." "I'm glad they do. I don't want to be shut up in a room. I would rather be out under the open sky." She poked at the rim of her tray again. "They never did tell us why, Bob. They didn't tell us anything, only that they had no alternative. We didn't hurt any Thanarians. We only destroyed one of their ships and some of their robots. We upset their sense of security and showed them they're not secure at all. I suppose they're afraid of an attack from Earth." "They didn't tell us anything," she said again. "They act as though we were animals." "No," he said. "They don't seem to have a very high opinion of our low position on the social evolution scale." He began to eat in the manner of one who knows the body needs nourishment to take advantage of any opportunity for escape, even though the mind may be darkly certain that no such opportunity shall arise. You ought to eat a little, Ginny, he said. She tried, and gave up after a few bites. I guess I'm just not hungry. Not now, she said. She glanced at the darkened window where the cat had become invisible. How long until daylight again, Bob? He looked at his watch. 7 hours. 7 hours. A touch of wistfulness came into her voice. I never noticed before how short the nights are. The robot laid the material Tan Current had requested on his desk, the records and tapes from the Terran ship, and withdrew. Tal Current sighed wearily as he inserted the first tape in the projector, wondering again why he felt the vague dissatisfaction, and wondering why he hoped to find an answer among the material from the Terran ship. It would be an all-night task, and he could hardly expect to find more than he already knew. Tharnar was not safe and secure from discovery by Terrans in the years to come, and faith in the robot fleet had been an illusion. Before setting the projector in operation, he put the recall to his daughter. Falna's image appeared before him, reclining on a couch where 2 robots worked at caring for her fingernails. She raised up a little as his image appeared before her, and the robot stepped back. Yes, father, she asked. She waited for him to speak, her wide grey eyes on his image, and her jet-black curls framing her young and delicately beautiful face. For a moment, she reminded him of someone more mature and strong. With something of a shock, he realized it was the Terran girl his daughter reminded him of, that the Terran girl seemed the more mature of the two, although Thrana was 28, and the Terran girl was 22. They had the same grey eyes and black curls, the same curve to the jaw, the same chin and full lips. But the similarity was only incidental. There was a grace and a gentleness to Thrana's beauty, a grace and gentleness that was the result of 50,000 years of civilization. Beneath the superficial beauty of the barbarian girl lay only an animal-like vitality and potential violence. Yes, father, Thralna asked again in her carefully modulated voice. Are you going to the theatre tonight, Thralna? Yes. Tonight's play was written by the Red Thorn, and is supposed to be almost as good as one of the classics. Why do you ask, father? I called to tell you that I have to work late tonight. I may not be home until morning. Couldn't you let a robot do it? No, I have to do it myself. Does it have to do with those 2 aliens? Yes. A little frown of worry appeared, and as quickly disappeared. Her slim fingers touched her forehead for a moment, to smooth away any vestige of a wrinkle. And she said, It will be such a relief when they're finally disposed of. Whenever I think of how they might escape and get into the city, it frightens me. Are you sure they can't escape, father? There is no possibility of their escaping, he said. You go ahead with your plans for the evening. Will you come home when the show is over? Not for a while. Kin is taking me dancing afterward. Where you went last time? The place where they were reviving the old dances? No, nobody goes there anymore. Those old dances were rather fun, but they were so tiring. Our modern dances are much slower and more graceful, you know. All right, Thralna, he said in dismissal. Enjoy yourself. Yes, father. She was reclining on the couch again, her eyes closed, when he switched off the image. He sat for a little while before turning on the tape projector, recalling his conversation with her, and a feeling growing within him that he was almost on the verge of discovering still another menace to Tharnar. Virginia held her hands to her face to shade her eyes as she looked out the window. What you can see of the city from here is all bright with lights, she said. But there's no one on the streets, only some robots. Everyone in the city must be in bed. That's the way it's been every night, he said. Early to bed and late to rise. They're an odd race. I wonder what they do to pass away the time. But what they're doing now is something you should be doing, resting. She turned away from the window. I'm not sleepy. I keep thinking of the cat out there waiting for us, and how we might get to it if we could only get hold of a blaster. Which we can't try to do until they come for us in the morning. Some rest now might mean a lot then. All right, Bob. She went to him and sat beside him on his cot. What is it now? How much more time? About 3 hours. She leaned her head against him, and he put his arm around her. I guess I am a little tired, she said, but don't let me go to sleep. All right, Ginny. It's only 3 hours and never any more, If we aren't lucky in the morning, and if we aren't lucky, I don't want to have wasted our last 3 hours.
Tal Caranth stood before the window again and watched the city as it slept in the pre-dawn darkness. How many slept in the city? Once there had been 3 million in the city, but each census found the population to be less. 5 years before, there had been less than 1 million. 2/3 of the city was a beautiful shell that housed only the robots that cared for it. What was wrong? And why had it never occurred to him before that there was something wrong? He went back to his desk, where the material from the Terran ship littered the eternally top of it, and sat down again. He was tired and frustrated. A menace faced Tharnar, and no one seemed to realize it. The coming of the barbarians had awakened him to the fallacy of trusting the robot fleet, but there was still another danger, and the robot fleet would be more helpless before the newly discovered danger than it would be before the Terran ships. He pressed a button, and music filled the room, music that had always before been soothing and restful to hear, but it sounded flat and meaningless compared with the throbbing barbarian music he had heard that night, and he switched it off again. It was wrong. It was one of the latest compositions, one that had been acclaimed as almost as good as one of the classics. Almost as good, like the play Thralna had attended, like the art exhibits, the athletic records, the scientific discoveries, like everything in the city and on Tharnar. Almost as good, but never quite as good as they had been 50,000 years before. Was that part of the answer? No, not part of the answer. Part of the problem. Part of the danger greater than a barbarian invasion. There was no answer that he could see. Something had been lost by the Thanarians 50,000 years before, and he was neither sure what it was, nor how to give it back to them. He pressed the button that would connect him with Security Officer Ten Quoth. Of the two problems, it was only within his power to handle the immediate phase of the first problem, to make the final authorization of the execution of the Terrans. Bob looked again at the window, which had lightened to a pale grey square. It was already daylight outside. It would not be long until the guards came for them. Virginia had fallen asleep at last, more tired than she had thought, and she still slept with her head against his shoulder and with his arm around her to support her. He straightened his legs slowly, not wanting them to be numb from lack of circulation when the guards came, and not wanting to awaken Virginia to grim reality any sooner than he had to. But the slight movement was enough. She opened her eyes drowsily, then the sleepiness gave way to the hard jolt of remembrance and realization. She looked at the grey window and asked, "How much longer?" "Within a few minutes." "I wish you hadn't let me sleep." "You were tired." "I didn't want to sleep. I didn't think I would." Then she changed the subject, as though to keep it from going into the sentimental. "I see the robot never did come back for the tray. We'll be leaving a messy room, won't we? I wonder if they'll disinfect it to make sure it's clean when we're gone. You know," she smiled a little, "fleas and things." She lifted her face to kiss him on the cheek. Then she rose and moved to the window. "It's cloudy," she said. "There's a mist of rain fallen, and it's cloudy outside. I guess it's already later than we thought." He went over to stand beside her, and he saw that the morning was alight with near sunrise behind the grey clouds. "It's out there waiting for us, the cat," she said. He saw it, standing silver-white in the grey morning, gleaming in the rain, and with its slim, dynamic lines making it look as though it might at any moment hurl itself roaring into the sky. "It's a beautiful ship," she said. "I wonder what they'll do with it when they—" A sound came from the far end of the corridor, a snapped command in Tharnarian. The command was followed at once by the sound of footsteps approaching their cell, the heavy tread of robots, and the lighter, softer steps of the guards. Virginia turned away from the window, and they faced the cell door as they waited. "This is it," she said. "Are you afraid, Ginny?" "Afraid?" She laughed up at him, a laugh that came only a little too quickly. "It's like a play, set a long time ago on Earth, coffee and pistols at dawn. Only I don't think they're bringing us any coffee, and if we get a pistol, it'll have to be one of theirs. It isn't over with till the end, and maybe we could change the ending of this play for them. I'll be watching you, Bob, so I can help you the moment you make the try." The Thanarian guards stopped outside the door, their blasters in their hands.
One of them unlocked the door, and 2 robots entered, guards locking the big door behind the robots the moment they were inside. The robots carried no blasters, nothing but 3 lengths of chain. The Thanarian leader outside the door rasped a command.
"You will both turn to face the window with your hands behind you."
Bob did not obey at once, but appraised the situation. The robots were massive things, more than 600 pounds in weight, their metal bodies invulnerable to any attack he could make with his bare hands. But there was one chance in 10,000. If he could catch the first robot by surprise and send it toppling into the cell door, its weight might be enough to break the lock of the door. He struck it with his shoulder, all his weight and strength behind the attack, and Virginia's small body struck it a moment later. But it was like shoving against a stone wall. The robot rocked for the briefest instant, then it threw out a foot to regain its balance. The other robot snapped a chain around his wrists, while Virginia fought it. "Don't, Ginny," he said, ceasing his own struggles. "It's no use, sonny." She stopped then, and the robot jerked her arms around behind her back to lock the second chain around her wrists. She smiled up into his dark and somber face. "We tried, Bob. They were just too big for us." A third chain, longer than the first 2, was produced. He felt the cool metal of it encircle his neck, and heard the lock snap shut. The other end of it was locked around Virginia's neck. The cell door was opened, and the guard leader commanded,
"Step forward. The robots will guide you."
They stepped forward, the robots beside them gripping their arms with steel fingers. The chain around their necks rattled from the movement of walking, linking them together like a pair of captive wild animals. Bob wondered if the chain had been solely as another precaution to prevent their escape, or if it had been a deliberate act of contempt. The Thanarians feared them, and because they feared them, they hated them. Did it bolster the morale of the Thanarians to deliberately treat them as though they were animals? They stepped out into the cool dawn, into a small courtyard with a black stone wall at its farther side. The sky was bleakly grey, and the rain was falling as a cold mist, dampening Virginia's face as she looked up at him. "The last mile, Bob." "Walk it straight and steady, Ginny. They're watching." "How else would we walk it?" she asked calmly. They came to the wall where a metal ring had been set in the stone. There was a chain fastened to the ring, and when the robots had swung them around with their backs to the wall, the free end of the chain was locked to the center of the chain around their necks. Again, it could be an added precaution, or it could be the final attempt to let their execution be like the killing of a pair of dangerous animals. It didn't really matter, of course. 2 of the armed robots who had walked with the guards took up a position 20 feet in front of them, blasters in their metal hands. The robots who had chained them stepped to one side, away from the line of fire. The leader of the guards lifted his arm to look at his watch and said something to the robots. The robots lifted their blasters at the words and leveled them, one aimed at Virginia's heart and one at Bob's. But the expected blast did not come. The guard leader continued to observe his watch. Apparently the first command had meant only aim. The fire command would come when the hands of the watch reached the 3312 mark. Virginia's shoulder was warm against his arm, but her hand, when it found his behind their backs, was cold. "They cheated us," she said. "We were supposed to have a whole firing squad." The guard leader gave another command, another double click as the robots pressed the buttons that would ready their blasters for firing. Virginia swayed a little for the first time, a movement too small for the Thanarians to see, and one from which she recovered almost at once. I'm all right," she said. "I'm not afraid, Bob." "Of course you're not, Ginny, of course you're not." The guard leader had returned his attention to his watch, and the seconds went by, long seconds in which the only sound was the almost inaudible whisper of the rain against the stone wall behind them. Virginia looked up at him for the last time, the cold mist wet on her face. "We've had a lot of fun together, Bob. We never expected it to end so soon, but we knew all the time that it might. We'll go together, and that's the way we always wanted it to be, wherever and whenever it might happen." Then she faced forward again, and they waited, the rain whispering in the wall behind them, and forming in crystal drops on the chain around their necks. He did not waver again as she stood beside him, and he knew she would not when the end came. The guard leader dropped his arm, as though he no longer needed to refer to his watch. He glanced at them very briefly, then turned to the robots, his face revealing the command he was going to give. Virginia's hand tightened on his own in farewell, and he could feel the pulse of her wrist racing hard and fast. But she stood very straight as she looked into the blaster, and they heard the final command to their robot executioners.
Darind Senda!
33-1. Tal Caranth looked again at the timepiece on the wall. 33-1. At the end of 11 more small fractions of time, the Terrans would no longer exist. What was life? What was the purpose behind it all? In 50,000 years, the Thanarians were no nearer the answer than their ancestors had been. Why should there be life at all? Why not the suns and planets, created by chance and devoid of life? And why even the suns and planets, the millions of galaxies racing outward across the illimitable expanse of space and time? Why the universe, and why the life it contained? Why not just nothing? The barbarians had set out to find the answer within 100 years after the building of their first interstellar ship, and Tharnar's interstellar ships had not been outside the system for 50,000 years. No Thanarian had been as far as Vendel for 15,000 years. Why had the Thanarians lost their curiosity? The curiosity and desire to learn that had created the past glory of Tharnar. He thought again of what he had discovered that night, of one of the reasons why the Terrans had named their ship the Cat. It was not because a cat was a dangerous animal, as he and the others had thought. It was because the mission of the Cat would be to explore in unknown territory, because of an old Terran proverb, curiosity killed a cat. He did not yet understand the second reason behind the name, but the first reason showed that the Terrans were not without a sense of humor. How long had it been since he had heard a Thanarian laugh at himself, at his own failings, or possibility of failure? Never. Yet, wasn't that pride? What was wrong with a high-headed pride that admitted no inferiority, no failure? Wasn't 50,000 years of civilization something of which to be extremely proud? 33-5. He went to the window and pressed the button that would open it against the mechanical will of the automatic health guard equipment. It slid open, and he breathed the cool, moist air that smelled of wet earth and grass, and the odor of the lana tree flowers that were closed against the rain and would not open until the sun came out. The city was quiet in the grey of the morning. He could see one pedestrian and 3 moving vehicles in the entire visible portion of the city. The city, like the flowers of the lana trees, were not open into life until the storm was over and the sun was shining again. 33-9. The city, like the flowers of the lana trees, the beauty and perfection of them both, was the result of 50,000 years of breeding to bring about that perfection. The city, like the flowers of the lana trees. But flowers were without purpose, were only vegetation. And what was the purpose of the city? He did not know. He was the supreme executive of Tharnar, and he did not know. 33-10. He went back to his desk and switched on the 3-dimensional projection of the scene that would be taking place in the courtyard behind the prison. The man and the girl stood chained to the wall, and the robots were waiting for the third and last command from the guard leader, the blasters in their hands, as steady as though held in vices, and their metal faces impassive. He increased the magnification of the scene, drawing the images of the man and girl closer to him. There was no reading the man's face, other than the hardness and lack of fear. But on the face of the girl was a defiance that seemed to shine like a radiance about her. He was reminded of the physical similarity between the barbarian girl and his daughter. But now the similarity had faded to a shadow. There was something vital and alive about the barbarian girl. There was a beauty to her in the way she waited for death that was strange and wild by Thanarian standards. What had Thralna said the night before? Whenever I think of how they might escape and get into the city, it frightens me. It frightens me. What if it was Thralna who stood before the robots? Would she have a Thanarian pride, as she looked into the black muzzle of the blaster, and knew she had only a few more heartbeats of life left? Would she stand with a bold defiance of the barbarian girl, or would she drop to the ground and plead for her life?
He knew the answer. But it was not Realma's fault that she was as she was. She was only like all the others of Tharnar. 33:11. How different they were, the two barbarians, and the men and the women of Tharnar. Yet the difference would cease to exist within a few moments, when the man and girl were dead, when all the life and restless drive were gone from them, and they lay still on the cold, wet ground. They would look the same as Tharnarians. How did it feel to die in the cold dawn on an alien world, 1,000 light years from your own? But they had known such a thing might happen to them. They'd named their ship the Cat because of that. Because of that and something else. Suddenly, clearly, he understood the second reason for the name of the ship. 33:12. The guard leader dropped his arm to give the last command to the robots. Tal Karant's mind raced, and he saw two things with vivid clarity. He saw the inexorable decline of Tharnar and the city continuing down the centuries until the little spark that was left smouldered its last and was gone. And he saw the way death would obliterate the wiles and savage beauty of the barbarian girl, knew that it would go when the life went from her, to leave her with a beauty that would be colourless by contrast, that would be like the beauty of a Lana blossom or a Thanarian woman. And he thought he could see the answer to the menace that faced Tharnar and the city. "Doran!" The guard leader's first word of command came. Tal Karant's finger stabbed at one of the buttons along his desk. He shoved it down to deactivate the robot executioners, and they were frozen in immobility when the final word came. "Tenda!" He snapped the switch, which connected him with the office of Security Officer Ten Quath, and said, "Have the change taken from the Terrans, and say that they are given comfortable and unguarded quarters. Tell them that they have been pardoned by the Supreme Executive, and that they are free to leave Tharnar whenever they wish." It was mid-morning of the next day, bright and warm, with a few fleecy white clouds drifting across the blue sky. Tal Karant stood before the window again, Vortigall beside him, and watched the city come to life, slowly and leisurely, as it had come to life each mid-morning for the past 50,000 years. Vortigall looked toward the Cat, where the boarding ramps had already been withdrawn and the airlocks closed. "They're ready to go," he said. "I hope you haven't made a mistake in what you did. The other Terrans will learn of us now, and when they come—" He let the sentence trail off, unfinished. "We have a great deal to gain by the coming of the Terrans," Tal Karant said, "and little to lose." "Little to lose?" Vortigall asked. "We have Tharnar and a city to lose. We have our lives and our civilization to lose." "Yes, our civilization," Tal Karant said. "Our God that we worshipped, our civilization. Look, listen to what I have to say. I did some thinking the night the Terrans were waiting to be executed. I'm afraid it was probably one of the few times, for thousands of years, that a Tharnarian ever tried to critically examine the Tharnarian way of life. I started from the beginning, more than 50,000 years ago, when the interstellar ships of Tharnar were actually interstellar, and were manned by men instead of robots. It was a good start we made in interstellar exploration, but it didn't last very long. We wanted to associate with our cultural peers, and there weren't any. We didn't attempt to make any contact with the primitive races we found. We felt that there would be no point in doing so. Tharnar possessed the highest and the only civilization in all the explored regions of the galaxy, and younger races had nothing to offer us. The time came when no more exploration ships were sent out. We retired to Tharnar and Vendal, and surrounded them with a robot-operated fleet to keep out the inferior races when they finally did learn how to build spaceships. We devoted ourselves to our social culture and became imbued with self-satisfaction, with the assurance that we of Tharnar possessed the full flowering of culture and progress. We withdrew into a shell of complacency, and each generation lived out its life with comfortable, methodical sameness, and our robot-operated fleet was on guard to prevent any other race from annoying us, from disturbing us in the wisdom and serenity of our way of life. 15,000 years ago, the last of us in Vendel returned to the more ideal world of Tharnar, and there was plenty of room for them on Tharnar by then. The population had been decreasing for thousands of years. It's decreasing right now. Women don't want to have children anymore. It's an inconvenience for them. They want comfort, the full stomach, the soft couch, the attention of their robots. And men are the same. There is no longer any incentive for living on Tharnar other than to duplicate the lives of our ancestors. There is nothing new, nothing to be done that has not already been done better. so we lapse into an existence of placid satisfaction with the status quo. We vegetate. We're like plants that have been seeded in the same field for so many centuries that the fertility of the soil is exhausted. This barren field in which we grow is our own form of culture. Do you see what the ultimate end will have to be, Vor?
He had thought old Vortigall would reply with a heated defense of Tharnarian civilization, but he did not. Instead, he said, "If the present trend continues, there will come a time when there will be more robots in the guard ships than there will be Tharnarians for them to guard. But is the other better? The destruction at the hands of the barbarians." "Destruction? It's within their power to destroy us, but why should they? It will be unpleasant for many Tharnarians to contemplate, but an unbiased study of the Terrans shows that they would not want the things we have on Tharnar and in the city, that they would not consider Tharnar and the city worth the trouble of conquest." "A conjecture," Vortigall said. "And even if you are right, and the Terrans never come to destroy us, what have we to gain by taking this risk?" "New life. We've been too long in the barren field of our own culture. We've lost our curiosity, our desire to learn, a sense of humour that would permit us to make honest self-evaluations, our pride and courage. And in losing these things, we lost our racial urge to survive. Look at the city this morning, Vor. See how slowly it moves. Listen to how still it is for a city that contains almost 1 million people. Do you know what this day is for the city? It's one more act, to be added to all the thousands of acts in the past, on the city's rehearsal for extinction. The Terrans have what we lost. They're a young race with a vitality that's like a fire, where our own is like a dying spark. That's why I let those two go, why I want the others of their kind to know of Tharnar and come here. It's not too late for us, not yet too late for contact with these Terrans, to give back to us all these things we lost." In the pause following his words, the quiet of the city was suddenly shattered by the thunder of the cat's drives. It lifted, shining and slender and graceful, and hurled itself up into the blue sky. Tower Corinth watched it until it was a bright star, far away and going out into the universe beyond, until the sounds of its drives had faded and gone. He looked away from the sky and back to the slowly moving, softly whispering city. The city that was dying and did not know it. He felt the stirring of an uneasiness within him, a strange, non-physical desire for something. It was the first time in his life that he had ever felt such a sensation. It was something so long gone from the Tharnarians that the Tharnarian word for it was obsolete and forgotten, but the Terran word for it was Wanderlust. "I almost wish I could have gone with them, Vor," he said. "They're going to try to reach the heart of the galaxy and see if they can find the answer to creation, and we on Tharnar spend our lives sipping sweet drinks as we discuss trifles and wait for the sun to shine warm enough for us to emerge from our air-conditioned houses." "If you're right in thinking that Terrans won't come to plunder Tharnar and the city," Vortigall said, "then it will be interesting to know what those two find when they reach the center of the galaxy. They don't get killed long before they reach it." "I think any hostile forms of life they encounter will find them hard to kill," Talcorinth said. "We paid a high price for their capture, remember? There were 2 Terran proverbs behind the name of their ship. It took me quite a while to understand the second one, but when I did, I realized the true extent of Terran determination and self-confidence. Their mission was to explore across the unknown regions of space. They knew it would be dangerous, very dangerous. So they named their ship the Cat, partly because of an old Terran proverb, curiosity killed a cat. But that was only half the reason behind the name. They intended to reach the center of the galaxy, and they didn't intend to let anything stop them. So there was a second meaning behind the naming of their ship. A cat has 9 lives. End of Story 6.